Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the show where professional screenwriters talk about the comic books that we love, mostly from the 80s. And today we have an amazing book to discuss. First of all, I'm Stephen Bagatourian, and I'm so excited about the discussion we had regarding this particular completely batshit insane comic. And my co-host here is Chris.
Hey, I'm Chris Derrick, and today we'll be talking about Skreemer, a book that DC put out in 1989. Wild, crazy book. And for those of you who haven't read it, here's a quick synopsis. The story is set 38 years after the fall of civilization in New York. The central character is Vito Skreemer, an imposing crime kingpin in the age when criminal warlords are nearly obsolete. His story is narrated by Peter Milligan as he looks back on both Vito's life and how it intersects with the lives of the Finnegan family, contrasting the former's rise to power with the latter's struggle to survive. This book is written by Peter Milligan, art is by Ewins and Steve Dillon, colorist is Tom Ziuko, the letterer is Tom Frame, assistant editor is Art Young, and the editor is Karen Berger. Now, in the episode, I mistakenly referred to the editor as Shelley Bond. So, just a quick recap if you haven't read this book, this is a gang story set in a post-apocalyptic United States. It's kind of like set in a world of like RoboCop, but pushed a little farther. And I think that's what's really crazy about this book. I can't believe this book like actually came out when it did.
This book, it's bananas.
Yeah. You know, so the story's about this guy's name is Vito Skreemer. He's a gang lord, and it's told in this weird kind of like third person narration. So Skreemer's he's not even telling his own story. And
Nope.
It's told, actually, it's a first person narration by someone who's not even in the story.
Right. It's actually pretty wild. And it reminded me a little bit of Saga, just in terms of the narration, kind of the way that Saga is being narrated by the daughter of Alana and Marco. And he's kind of looking back on, telling her parents' story or whatever. And of course, this story predated Saga by quite a bit, by many decades. But that was the only comic that I instantly thought of that it reminded me of. Yeah, just to say here at the outset that I agree with you 100%. This story is fucking wild, and it's extremely original. Like, it's a very original story that it does not feel like anything else. It's a post-apocalyptic gangster story, as you said. It's also like an incredibly cerebral yet emotional and like existential story that just deals with like so many motifs and metaphors, and like I just can't even think of anything like this that mashes up James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake with a gangster story, and you've got this incredibly bizarre construction of the narrative that is being told by this character who's not even in the story and is recounting this tale. You're not quite sure who's even telling it at first, and then we jump around in time in a way
There's a lot of jumping around in time.
So much. And it's fucking wild. Like, I can't even think of another comic book story that does what Pete Milligan and Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon are doing here in terms of the chronology and how incredibly quickly and liberally they're jumping around in time, because you're just jumping perspective and shifting just decades at a time constantly throughout the story, back and forth. And it's kind of disorienting at first, but it does hold together, and it works in a really interesting way. And Milligan's always doing these really interesting transitions just through dialogue often, where, you know, a phrase that somebody's saying connects with a phrase that another character said 30 years before or 30 years after.
I thought that
And
was genius. I thought that was
yeah,
genius. It's something. It's one of those like it's one of those things that would be like a motif in a movie where somebody looked at something and then it would be like a close up and then you look at that and then the cut would be we're looking at that and then it would pan off and we see we're like 30 years in the past. So
yeah,
it's something
exactly.
that movies can do visually and that they can do with audio too. But I think that the type of kind of like transitions that this is doing, it would be hard to, I mean, look, you could do it in a movie if you weren't doing an American film. I think that
Yeah,
the Europeans or the East Asians could do this, but Americans would be, I think the studio executives would not understand what you're trying to do. And that's what's crazy about this story. And this is, again, it's one of the, we talk about this a lot, not as podcasts, but stuff that, and we probably will later on, but things that we talk about a lot is there's stuff that comics can do that no other kind of like storytelling type of medium can do. I mean, I think what the thing that you said, what I loved about this is the James Joyce and Finnegan's like Wake kind of motif that kind of like is the grounding piece of this entire story.
hmm,
And that to me, again, like I told you, I was like 13, 14 when I read this, and I was like, I remember the thing that shocked me the most about this was how just utterly violent it was and still is. I mean, it's crazy. So you read something from this is like 1989, so it's 30
hmm.
some years ago, 33 years ago, and it was longer than 33 years. Almost,
Something like that. Yeah,
it's
no, that sounds right.
yeah, yeah, and it's like it's the violence is still shocking now,
Yeah,
and after
yeah,
after all the stuff you've seen in
yes.
movies and TV and and in comics, and that's what stuck with me the most about this book, and that's why I want to talk to you about it because that's what I remembered the most about it. I don't remember so much of the narrative stuff that Dylan that Milligan is doing that at the time, like I didn't know who the hell James Joyce was when I was reading this,
Yeah,
and,
of
and
course.
honestly, I feel bad because I've never read any of his work, and I've always wanted to attempt to read like Ulysses. I remember I was supposed to read Dubliners in college, and I never did.
Hmm.
But I feel like I want to read his work because, this is similar to what we had talked about in our episode about Nexus, is that you and this was interesting about non-superhero comics is that they're able to reference like literature in a way that would be so I think inappropriate in a superhero comic.
Yeah.
And but it makes like reading this so much more enjoyable, particularly now as an older reader, because I
Hmm.
get what he's doing. Now, granted, it says on the cover suggested for mature readers because this is prior to Vertigo. This is what 4 years before Vertigo launched. But like we were saying offline, it's the team that launched Vertigo. It's edited by Karen Berger, and assistant editor is Shelley Roberg. Who did she marry? She married
Oh, Shelley.
that
She became
artist.
Shelley Bond. She
Oh, Shelley.
married
She becomes
Philip.
Shelley Bond later on.
Yeah, Philip
Yeah,
Bond, the artist.
yeah, Philip Bond. So it's interesting to see, was this a book? I'm just wondering, like, did Karen Berger have an idea for she wanted to launch Vertigo or something or some sort of like mature line at DC? Because maybe she saw some success with Epic at Marvel and was like, how can DC do something like that? And I wonder if she had to convince, Jeanette Kahn. I don't know. She had to convince Jeanette Kahn. I don't think because Jeanette Kahn, was responsible for like Watchmen and stuff like that. But just wondered to have an imprint that was solely doing stuff that was non superhero stuff. And I think that's the difference between like again like Watchmen and Dark Knight is that's not that superhero stuff that's twisted in this lens, and this is totally not.
It's
And
totally not.
it's I mean it's just like the brutality in this book doesn't overwhelm the poetics of the story. And I think that's really fascinating. I think that the art is really, really strong too for what what the book is trying to convey about, consequences of your actions. Because I think it's interesting that the guy Finnegan, whose grandson is telling the story, when you
Hmm.
meet that guy and what he's going through and the choices he has to make just to survive in this world that is collapsing. I mean, look, he breaks it all down and he gives you no dates. He just calls it after the fall, which is just like, okay, well, that's wild. It's, you know what's funny? If you remember, I was writing that one screenplay I brought into our writers group called Resonance, and I kept saying, "Hey, this is 25 years after the fall," because
I forgot about that.
because I was as my little like setup, because I didn't want to set a date for it, and I'm just wondering if subconsciously I remembered that he did it in this book, and it's such a really wild way to start telling a story.
It's
Because
very
you meet
evocative.
Skreemer,
It's
you
really
meet
cool.
Skreemer as a kid, and it's 8 years after the fall, and then you meet him like when he's at the height of his powers, and it's like 30 years after the fall, and it's just it's something that I kind of love as a reader, because it keeps me engaged. I got to keep like I can't just like read this kind of half-assed, and it's something that makes it that you keep reading it, and there's some stuff that makes you want to turn away because of how violent it is. But it's the characters are well drawn. They're well created. They're well. I mean, and even though Skreemer is a cipher, and it's, we won't spoil what happens in the final issue. It explains where, like his whole kind of like rationale for how he behaves. I think this was interesting too. Is like, so, like, how do you look at Skreemer as Vito as a character? Because he's the title character, but he's not explored really.
That's a fascinating point. Now, that's actually interesting that you call him a cipher, because I hadn't thought about that so directly, but I think that's totally accurate. He is very much a cipher up until the very last issue, where he reveals his motivations and kind of what's been going on in his inner life. I think his character is fascinating, and I want to back up for a second, because I think we started to do the summary, and we should probably just go through the summary of the story, and then it's hard because I think we're always very excited to dive into the discussion. But just for the benefit of anyone who hasn't read Skreemer, this is a completely insane post-apocalyptic gangster story set in America. I also really want to take a moment to celebrate the production value and the design of this comic, and the actual design for this book is really ahead of its time and looks fantastic. Like, it just really, it pops. And every one of the covers are terrific. The covers have these incredibly gaudy, garish, almost neon colors. The first issue in particular is highly iconic looking to me. It's a cover that really burned into my mind. And whoever designed the logo and just the whole look of the book, I think they really put together a hell of a package. It's a incredible looking comic. To me, like, this is pretty close to my ideal in my mind of what I think of as like pop comics, like comics that really feel like almost magical cultural artifacts that just have this incredible power to them. And then you get into the story, and there's something really just so incredibly provocative about every bit of it. And I agree with you, Chris. There are a lot of moments where I kind of had to look away or take a break after reading parts of Skreemer, because it does get so intense. The violence is highly shocking still. The sexual situations are highly shocking. And there is so much in this book that I feel like ensures it would virtually certainly not be published today. I cannot imagine DC Comics and Warner Brothers, their parent company, ever publishing something that pushed up to the very edge of everything and beyond the way that Skreemer does. So, having said all that, this post-apocalyptic story set in America after the fall, as you say, there's been some kind of crazy event where society has splintered, everything's gone horribly wrong, and these gangs have taken over. And the gangs are run by leaders that are referred to as presidents. So there are multiple presidents. Cool. Yeah, which is really cool. Multiple presidents who are kind of running things. And as we pick up, we realize that these presidents have sort of these dark angels, they call them, who work for them as like their main killers or their main muscle, so to speak. And those people are referred to as Skreemers. And so in this particular story, we're following with Vito Skreemer, and he's our title character, our eponymous character, and we're in the first issue. We meet him, and there's so many different storylines going on. It's a challenge to summarize this, but maybe we can go back and forth, and you can help, and let's see if we can get just the broad strokes of this down in 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can actually have like a really big detailed discussion of the shit that's happening. We got multiple narrative threads. So Vito Skreemer has 2 best friends, and one of them is Dutch Amsterdam, and the other one is a woman, and the woman's name is Vicky Chandler, I believe. And so he's got these 2 best friends who he grew up with as kids, and they're kind of in this gangster organization of his that he's like one of the top figures in. And in our first issue, we see that Vito Skreemer has organized this dinner. It's a summit for all of these gang leaders that are coming to eat and discuss gang business. And he's got his 2 best friends, Dutch and Vicky, here at this summit. And suddenly, the summit turns into a massacre where all these gang lords, all these presidents who've come to attend this summit are all suddenly being executed. And this includes Vito's friends who are in the middle of the crossfire here, his lieutenants, so to speak. And what happens is one of them, Dutch, gets kidnapped, and we realize that Dutch is being betrayed by Vicky, and apparently Vito perhaps as well, although I think he doesn't know that it's Vito yet. And the most horrific thing happens in issue 1. Like one of the most horrific things I can think of that I've ever seen in a mainstream comic book, where Dutch is like fucking, he's bolted to a table in a crucifixion Jesus pose. A cage is placed on his face, and then a rat that is like this scabby, cancerous rat, as they describe it in the story, this horrific little monster is dropped down into the cage. And as the gangster who's doing this says to Dutch, its only way out of the cage is going to be down, Dutch, down through your face. Think about it. Those claws, those teeth digging into your nose, gnawing at your eyes, burrowing into your screaming mouth, all of that's going to happen unless you tell us. And they're trying to get some information out of Dutch. And Dutch says, "Oh God, please, I don't know, please." And they say, "Not good enough, Dutch, not nearly good enough." And they drop the fucking little monster into the cage, and it starts eating Dutch's face off. Like,
and that shot of the monster, that shot of the rat with like these boils and his fucked up face.
Oh my God, it's so gross. It's so like, gross.
I mean,
I don't know what to say. Like, what the fuck, Chris? What is this? What are we reading? What the fuck is this?
I mean, I'm gonna tell you right now. Now, this is amplified from what happens to Winston in 1984, right? But it's done on such a higher degree because in 1984 you're just reading about it. The fact that you're seeing this, I mean, I think in 1984, I haven't read this in forever. I think the rat doesn't eat through the guy. It's just a threat. I think I think they're threatening with him. They threatened Winston in 1984.
Yeah.
They don't even. I mean, they do this in this because, again, what's great about it is that Vicky has known Dutch since they were kids. They used to run this little street gang. She knows that's his biggest fear, like the way Jones hates snakes and shit like that. Indiana Jones, and it's so shocking when Vito finds Dutch later, and like the look on what remains left of Dutch's face is like it's worse than Two-Face.
Mm-hmm.
It's fucked up. It's just like, what the fuck is going on here? I mean, like I said, this is the type of stuff that just burned into my brain as a as a young teen, and it's a really interesting. What's great about it is it's setting you up with these tropes about gangster stuff that we have seen and understand. The thing at the beginning with the dinner parties, like the Godfather thing with the not the Godfather, but it's just that setup where they're all going to set up and get killed. It's kind of like the Godfather at the end of the first one when they're that montage but it takes it to another level because like Vicky, who we find out later, this was interesting, is that she's betrayed by Skreemer Vito, not by it's by sex. It's a sexual betrayal that
Right.
she is still harboring the grief over. And it kind of plays into that one Shakespeare line, like hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And it's like she is so angry at him for years. And it's like, and even though she and Dutch were friends first, and she loves Dutch from that very platonic like love, she still is willing to go through this type of crime against him to get at Vito, and that tells you the level of anger that she has toward Vito. And it's just it sets up, that's what's interesting. It's like the emotional evaluation that these characters are going through are so high, and we're telling all the story like this, and we're flashing back to when Vito and Dutch and Victoria are maybe like 10, 11, and 12, and we're meeting this guy Finnegan, whose son is later part of Screamer's gang, whose grandson is is the narrator of this.
Yeah, telling the
And
whole story.
telling the whole story. And Finnegan, he goes through, I mean, it's given us a point of view and a like of how the average Joe is living in this
That's actually a great point, man.
this
Yeah, sorry to
broken
interject.
society.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. You're right, though. That's the point of the Finnegan character, because that
Yeah.
without Finnegan, we wouldn't see what the average person in Screamer's world, what their life is like.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that it's something I had a conversation with my manager one time about a pilot I was working on, a sci-fi thing, and they were like, "Can you show us what that world is?" And I feel like, that's the thing that in a lot of really good science fiction, this pushing the world, not to say the space stuff, but when the world's kind of collapsing, you almost got to show us that, so that we as regular readers can get a sense of how our life might be like in this world and the choices that we have to make. Because what is it, issue 4? Like Finnegan's got to make a fucked up choice in issue 4.
Oh my god, yeah, we'll get to that, but yeah, oh my god, that's also one of the craziest fucking things I've ever seen in a comic book. I mean,
wild. We don't see it, but we're told what happens.
Yeah.
Because I think if we were to see it, God. I don't even think it's too much to be even a comic.
You couldn't even do it.
Yeah. So so that's kind of the first issue. Then
wait, hold on. Sorry, hold on. I want to jump in with the Finnegan character. I should say that this average man that we're setting up in this world, whose grandson is telling us the story. What happens in the first issue is he's taking a truck on like a run for his boss, and he's working for one of these gangs in this world, and he suddenly hears the cargo in his truck making some noise, and then he goes around and he opens it up to see what it is he's transporting, and he realizes it's a bunch of young girls who are just children, who are being sold into sexual slavery for one of these fucked up gang lords. And so this guy, Finnegan, is a good man, and he's horrified by what he's inadvertently doing. And he goes and he quits his job, and he goes back to the guy who told him to do this, and he punches him, and he lets the girls go. And the guy says, like, you fucked up. You shouldn't do this, because these girls, they were heading to President Tiberius White, who's like one of the ultimate horrible monster presidents in this world. And so his boss is like, you fucked up now. You let those girls go. You're a dead man, basically. And so you better get moving. And so this is the interesting thing with the Finnegan character, is that he now takes his family. He's got a wife and 3 small children, one of whom is a very sick girl. And that was part of the reason he refused to do this, is because, like, he's got his own daughters, and he was like, what kind of a man would I be to do this? I have my own kids. And so now he's quit the job, and him and his family are basically on the run because he's made an enemy of this horrible gangster figure in this world. And so I want to call that out because it's a really interesting thread thematically, because a lot of what Skreemer is talking about is in the story, and what Pete Milligan is exploring is this idea of morality and being a good person, and whether it makes sense to be a good person in a world that is so brutal and is just in ruins, where you're surrounded by all of these characters giving in to the most horrific demonic impulses. And I think Milligan is continually returning to this question of, like, can you even be a good person? Because through being a good person, this guy Finnegan is now putting his family in a really fucked up position.
It's serious risk. Well, you know what? It goes into a theme that he explores in this very much is, what's the power of your individual choice? And what are the consequences of the choices that you make, and can you live with the consequences?
Hey folks, sorry for the interruption, but thank you so much for listening to the show. And Chris and I are just gonna elbow our ways in here briefly to tell y'all about our Patreon. And we're hoping that you'll consider very seriously signing up for our Patreon, which is only $2 a month. And for those $2 for 200 pennies a month, which these days is not even a cup of coffee at Starbucks. It's so little money to ask for, and we're gonna be offering you so much in return, but it would make a massive difference to us if you could sign up to be part of our show via the Patreon family, because we're going to be offering you in return 2 free one-shot episodes. Okay, they're not free, but 2 episodes that are exclusive to our subscribers on this Patreon platform. And these 2 one-shot episodes will feature Chris and I talking about books that we're not otherwise going to be discussing on the show at some length, and you will be surprised by some of these books that we cover. And that's not all, though. For the $2 a month, you're also going to get even more. Chris, what else do they get on Patreon?
You will be able to send us questions for the Q&A show that we have planned. It's more than one, but it's the first one will either be between seasons 1 and 2, or it'll be sometime in season 2, or it'll be after. And something we'll figure out as we go along. But you'll be able to put questions in and ask us anything that we want to talk about. Who's our favorite indie pop, like comic publisher editor we should talk about.
Totally.
There's something like that. We'll see what happens. Just ask us any question you want about comics from the 80s, and we will get to that on the Q&A show. We will also open up to subscribers only an opportunity to suggest what books we should read and cover for subsequent seasons. So please subscribe. We would so much appreciate it, and you get a chance to participate in the show and help the show grow and help us decide what books that we're going to cover. Sure, there's a huge list, but there's always ones that we want to hear what the fans want to talk about as well. And so, Steve, what comic might you talk about during your one-shot episode?
Okay, there's a comic that I might want to talk about here that was an underground comic that was published way back in the good old days of the 1970s. It was considered part of the underground comics movement in a sense. The book is called The First Kingdom, and it came out from roughly the years 1974 to 1977. And it was a 24-issue, 768-page comic that took its creator, Jack Katz, 12 years to complete. And it was an underground comic, ostensibly, but it had very science fiction kind of concerns and vibes. It's a sci-fi fantasy story that opens in a post-apocalyptic world, and it's got all kinds of madness going on, gods and goddesses, apocalyptic sci-fi. It's a really epic story with an unbelievably dense and detailed art style. The comic had a lot of fans amongst other cartoonists at the time. Jack Katz was admired by such people as Will Eisner and Jim Steranko, and even Jack Kirby had very positive things to say about the work that Jack Katz was doing. And comic book historian R.C. Harvey, according to Wikipedia here, believed that Jack Katz was the first person in comics to pursue a personal vision at such length. And so he was quite a trailblazer. He was a unique figure in comics history. And I've never really looked at his work with any degree of detail, but I did happen to buy a complete set of The First Kingdom off eBay last year. It's a wonderfully bizarre looking underground comics. I've got all the floppies, and I'm excited to dive in, and I think I'd love to talk about it in one of these episodes here. And Jack Katz, by the way, happens to still be alive. He is 96 years young, and the man is from Brooklyn, New York originally. I don't know where he lives today, but I hope he's doing well, and I'm excited to check out his work finally after hearing a lot about it. So The First Kingdom by Jack Katz. That's something I will be covering on the show.
I need to get a copy of what you bought. I want to read this.
It's pretty wild. It looks incredible. Like the art style. Everybody listening to this, look up The First Kingdom, Jack Katz comic online. The art style is mind-blowing. It is extraordinarily detailed and very, very ahead of its time. It's wild-looking work. Beautifully drawn. Really beautifully drawn. Anyways, that's one of my books, Chris. What are you thinking? What's in the chamber for you for these solo episodes?
I'm going to read. It's a single issue. It's issue number 32 of Marvel Premiere. It has the character. This is done by Howard Chaykin. It's a character named Monarch Star Stalker, and it's a book that I heard about for a long time. I can never get my hands on it until eBay, and I got on eBay about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I read it, I loved it, I was fascinated by it. I always kind of love that mid to late 70s sci-fi that people were doing. I think people were like really, really influenced by like psychedelics in a way that they weren't later. You know,
it's
and
true.
And so, not that I think that I know that, and it's and so it kind of like bleeds into the work of these comic artists like that. And this is one of those books that's early Howard Chaykin. You know, predates American Flag. I mean, it's he's working for Marvel. It's like 78 or 77 or something like that. I can't remember when, but that's the book that I feel I might cover in our special one-shots that you will be able to get if you subscribe to this Patreon for $2 a month. Please, fans, we would enjoy it and love it and appreciate you very much. And now we will get back to Comics Rot Your Brain.
And I feel that this guy, Finnegan, he makes a choice that is the right moral choice, but he suffers consequences because this is such an unrepentant world. I remember there's this movie I read called The Town Without Pity, some old Kirk Douglas film, and it's like this is a society without pity, because this guy makes a choice that puts his family on the lam. His oldest daughter dies because they got to move her, and he quit his job, and he can't get the medicine for her, and he gets that whiskey from the guy, that one guy who's it's the ripple effect from his choices causes him to do things that he would rather not be forced to do, but he's trying to do the good thing. And it's interesting because in terms of how Skreemer behaves is the choices that he makes are fucked up too. Because I'm telling you right now, that scene where his dad gets killed in the beginning and he's getting chased by that wino, and he's got that bear trap that's set up to catch the dude. It's just like like the level of violence and the like the demonic creativity in the violence is
It's actually they're rat traps, which brings us back to the motif of rats in this world too, because we start with the rat on Dutch's face at the beginning, and it's one of the flashbacks to young Vito Skreemer is we realize that this old wino murdered his father in front of him, and Vito watched this happen, and then the wino tries to murder young Vito when he's like, I don't know, little kid, like 11 years old or something, and young Vito engineers the situation where the wino steps right into these two rat traps, and then the kid fucking beats him to death. Just beats this man to death savagely, and it's the first person he kills.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have it. I can't remember in front of me. But is the guy? Does he just want to kill him, or like does he want to rape him first?
Oh, I think there is the intimation he's going to rape him. And that's something we should say with Skreemer that is horrific and ugly, but it's a big part of this world. And I read an interview with Pete Milligan after reading the story, which kind of shed a little more light on this. In the interview I read, Milligan said that his writing always comes back to three main concerns. And his three main concerns as a writer, he finds, are life, death, and sex. And ultimately, I think these are the things that Skreemer revolves around. And so I say that because virtually every time there's a moment of extreme violence, it's almost always joined with some suggestion of sexuality, whether it's explicit or implicit. So often characters are about to kill each other and or assault each other in ways that are charged both with sexual and violent tension. And it's like in the world of Skreemer, these things are inextricably intertwined.
Yeah, but and again but the level of the way that he amplifies it in like in this book again goes back to your comment earlier about like this wouldn't be published today.
You know? Oh, no way. I just don't see it.
No, I mean, I'm not sure if there's a trade paperback of this series. I doubt there is because I'm sure people are like, hey, where is this? But I'm sure that they're like, we can't. This is a book that I'm pretty sure that Karen Berger put out kind of under the radar, and I'm not sure what the sales on it were. But, you know, I know that they were like, we can't do anything like this again. And I can't think of a book that Vertigo, like, you know, that they later published that was this graphic. I mean, there's a lot of violence in those Vertigo books. That's what's kind of interesting about them. I mean, like some of the violence in Preacher, some of the violence in The Invisibles, you know, is pretty it's pretty horrific too. But you make a great point. It's like it's the violence always kind of revolves around some sort of sexual situation. Again, like I was saying earlier, that Vicky is, you know, she's inflicting violence on Dutch, you know, because she was this woman whose sex was kicked back in her face, you know, like by Vito. Yeah, it's just, you know, I mean, I don't know what to say about the first issue, but it's just
yeah, it's crazy. It's so crazy, and I just looked it up because I was curious. Because to your point about the trade paperback, I'd never seen a trade paperback for Skreemer. It looks like they did publish one in 2002, but it's been out of print, as far as I can tell, for almost 20 years. I don't think they ever reprinted it. But there is a handsome looking trade paperback that's out of print with a nice cover. And it actually alerts us to the fact that this apparently was the winner of the Eagle Award for Best Continuing US UK Series, which is kind of shocking. And I guess hats off to the Eagle Awards for giving an award to such an incredibly transgressive and provocative series. But yeah, so if you want to find that Skreemer trade paperback, you got to dig around for it. Perhaps there's that one printing, but as always here on Comics Rot Your Brain, I would recommend everyone find these individual issues because they're cheap as hell and they are beautifully designed, and it'll just be an even better experience. And I gotta say, one thing I noticed reading this, Chris, there's no ads hardly at all in the middle of these stories. Like comparing to modern day comics, I'm looking at the first issue right now. As far as I can tell, there's only 2 pages of ads in a first issue that runs 28 story pages. And one of the ads is just a house ad. Oh, I'm sorry, 3 pages. Is it 3 pages? Yeah, 3 pages of ads. But that's 3 pages of ads in a story that, you know, is a significantly long story. And, you know, it's impressive to me that these days comics have so many ads in them that to have just 3 or 4 ads in a 28-page comic, that's reasonable.
Yeah,
but comics these days, they have a lot more interruptions.
Well, I think I don't remember how much comics were in '89. I know they weren't $2, and the cover price on this like is $2. And comics might have been 75 cents at this time, or they might have been $1. But I think that's part of the bumped price on this is because, who's going to advertise in this book?
Apparently, that's a good point. There's two house ads, and now counting it carefully, Warner Brothers was comfortable advertising for one of their hair metal bands, the Bullet Boys, and then there's an ad for Questar Science Fiction Fantasy.
Yeah,
but that's a great point, though, because today you could not get a single corporation to place an ad in a book that is this wildly offensive. I can't imagine.
You can't at all. I mean, in the back of the book is the back cover, issue 1 is Dead Calm, which is another, like, it's a Warner Brothers movie. So, and this, DC is Warner Brothers, so they're not. I mean, it's like they're gonna reap their own, like, whatever from this. But I feel like I mean. You said, so this got the Eagle Award for that. That's pretty fascinating. But again, it's because, look, again, it's like at this time, there was no books published like this. There was no books that this level of, like, pushing the envelope. And I mean, I want to say, this come out 89. I want to say this is like, it's taking the reins off of so many writers, particularly those British writers who became the mainstays at Vertigo. Yeah. So should we jump to issue 2 real quick?
Yeah, for sure. That was a long-ass discussion / summary of issue 1. But I think that's one of the tricky things about Skreemer is there is literally so much going on in each issue. These are very dense stories, and it just reminds me of in the days before decompressed storytelling hit comics. This was such a just substantial read. This is not a comic you can read in 5 minutes or 7 minutes or 8 minutes. Every issue is just jam-packed with content. There's so many storylines going on that ultimately the 6 issues feels like something that would be told in 12 issues today.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know what I mean? Like there's so much packed in here. So yeah, so that's issue 1. We're setting all these different pieces on the board, all these different storylines, and so in issue 2,
I'll just give an example in issue 2 about the storylines. Like I'm just flipping through, like on page 19, all those near the end of it. There's 3 tiers of panels, right? So there's the Finnegan story at the top. There's the Skreemer story in the present, the story's present, and then the last page is the Skreemer story in the past when he's like around 21 or 22 or something like that. And that's like, I mean, that's all on one page. Like he's jumping around that much, and it's like,
it's crazy.
I mean, that's how dense this story is, and it's not that it's dense, like it's hard to read, but it's like it's the story that he's trying to tell, and again, it's what I say all the time. It's like, can you keep me engaged as the reader? So I don't have to. So I'm not sitting here. It's the one thing about, like, a lot of movies today is that, like, I can watch them, and if I want to be jacking off, I can, because I don't need to be. I could, because I'm not that engaged per page. And there's so much going on in this. It's just, it's really, it's a lot, but it's great because he's trying to tell you again about what choices you make as people. How do you live in a society that's falling down? I mean, so issue 2 is kind of like, it picks up at the, it's a direct pickup from the end of issue 1, where Skreemer has come to rescue his friend Dutch from that crucifixion type of torture, and takes him away. And I mean, like this guy's clothing, like this big fur jacket he has on, and it's Skreemer. It's just in that wide brim hat. It's like a cowboy hat. It's not. I mean, today it'd almost be like a bowler hat, you would think, but it's just like there's so much going on in this. And then and in this issue, this tells us more about, like, how Skreemer and Dutch and Vicky were, like, like as kids, and what they were doing as, to start their gang. It goes into, like the plan that Vicky is now, because she's now she's a president on her own right, and how she's surviving, and how the other presidents are trying to take down Skreemer, and they're trying to set this plot up about what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that Vicky has become a president in her own right, because it's true. Although she had the betrayal by Skreemer which is motivating her, the romantic betrayal that she had with him. There's also this aspect of Vicky, which I love as a character, Vicky Chandler, where she has her own ambitions for power and she has her own ambitions to take over. And she's not just content to be like a sidekick to Skreemer. She is now a president in her own right, and she is seizing power in this world. And we realize that she was responsible for the betrayal of Dutch.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and she, in issue 2, she says, Dutch, poor Dutch. Maybe I should have killed him. Better than leaving him with half a face.
Yeah.
I've known him since I was, I don't know. And then someone says, bit late to be sentimental, President Chandler. The rat was your idea, remember?
Yeah,
Which is amazing.
yeah, because see, you make an interesting point about she has her own ambitions, and because you're saying that to me now, I'm wondering. This just feels like in the story, it's like, did she want to sleep with Skreemer because she knew that he was on this trajectory of this power grab trajectory, and she might have felt like, I can get there faster, or not even just faster, but more, maybe I don't know, but like I can get there too, by sleeping with him, by becoming the gangster's. She's not the gangster's mall. She's saying, I'm going to play that role for a minute until I can, turn it over and be my own, and lead my own crew. And I think that's what's really interesting about her character, because honestly, it's kind of like she's the antagonist of this, story. And it's like her motivations are almost solely about, you fuck me over and I can't let you win that one. And that means that Dutch has to get his face eaten off by a rat. So be it.
So be it.
It's one of the things that I think is interesting about female characters who are on these kind of power trips, because it's not necessarily a trait that naturally women are about. And I'm not to say that that women don't want power and don't want to be in the driver's seat of things, but I think that the level of excessive control that you have to wield as a gang lord is not like you're Sheryl Sandberg trying to run Facebook or something like that. It's a different level of like trying to push power, and control things. And it's fascinating that she's then attracted to this man who again, it makes you get look, he's like the bad boy. He's the ultimate bad boy, like when they're teens and their 20s. I think that's why she wants him. But then it's letting cautionary tale, you can't fuck around with bad boys because they have their own agenda that's not good for you. But then we go back to Finnegan's story, and it's like that moment, like he's on the run, he's trying to save his family, and he finds this whiskey. Because it's interesting how like whiskey and alcohol is this major kind of like this scarcity for it, and you realize that, wow, in a world like this, like how many people would be just trying to self-medicate just to survive, and it's kept on this really small quantity level, that when he can steal a bottle of whiskey, he realizes that he can sell that to like for drugs, to for pharmaceuticals, like it's got that much kind of like street currency. I think that's like a fascinating like this commentary on how he's orchestrating this world. Because you would think that, that's the thing too. There's not much like explicit kind of like drug use, like the narcotics. But I wonder if that's just a thing about what you'd be able to put in a story, like a comic like this.
I mean, I don't know, man. They put a lot in here. Like, I can't imagine what they're holding back.
Well, you're right, but I'm just wondering. It's like, well, but there's no one shooting up. There's no one snorting cocaine. It's just,
it's funny if that's where they draw the line when you consider some of the stuff we're about to get to. Like, this is so fucking wild. And just, I think you're right. The Vicky character is fascinating, and there's some really just compelling stuff going on with all the characters here. And really, you could explore the motivations of every single character, all the men and women in this storyline seem to have multiple agendas, and they all have a lot of stuff going on. And I think none of the characters are exactly what they seem at first blush. And there's a lot of a rich kind of there's a rich inner life to every one of these characters, and I think it's what's really compelling the further you go down this rabbit hole. I think that as we go through issue 2, Vito goes and rescues his buddy Dutch, who's got his face chewed off by the rat. Dutch doesn't realize yet that Vito was also kind of aware that this was going to be happening, or Vito was aware that he was putting Dutch in a very dangerous, precarious place, or that he knew this was going to happen to him. Dutch is still thinking that Vito's his friend at this point. And then we cut to Vicky sort of having a little bit of regret over what she did, and we realize she's on her own path. And then we cut back to the childhood, as you said, when they were just a kid gang, and we realized that Dutch as a kid had this horrible fear of rats, which Vicky was capitalizing on. And then we come out of there and we see that we go to the Finnegan family back in the quasi present day, or closer to present day, and the Finnegan family is having issues with one of their daughters being really sick. And so Finnegan himself goes out for a walk, and this is where he finds the whiskey that he essentially steals off of this homeless guy, or this drunk who's drinking whiskey, which is valuable in this world. He steals the whiskey off him, gets in a fight with him, and takes it away from this dude. And it's really like the first bad thing that Finnegan has done. I think it's the first time he's sort of done something morally questionable. And then when Finnegan at that point is on his way home, he encounters Jesus on a cross and has this religious moment staring. We've got a lot of religious symbolism throughout the story. This is now our second cross imagery that's like full page imagery of Jesus on the cross. In the first issue, we had Dutch on the cross, and now we have actual Jesus on the cross. There's a ton of biblical allusions going on throughout Skreemer, and it's something we hear a lot of in the narration. And not only biblical allusions, but there's this idea that is returned to over and over again that ultimately pays off about whether or not God has foreknowledge of what is going to happen to human beings, or whether God, in allowing human beings to have free will, that God themselves has no foreknowledge of what is to happen to human beings. And that's something that is just a question we return to over and over again. But here, Finnegan, after he steals the whiskey from the wino, when he was taking a break from his house and his sick daughter and all the stress of it all, now he finds himself on his knees in front of Jesus. He's praying, as the description says here, he'd almost forgotten how to pray and to whom he might pray, to this cracked Christ, this broken altar. But the light still squeezed in, all the ruin, the filth, all the destruction. It hadn't completely blocked out the light. And then Finnegan makes this really earnest prayer about his daughter. And he says, please, God, if you just let Katie live, I know I shouldn't have taken the whiskey, but I know you'll understand. Just let my Katie get better. And then we hear from there, Finnegan goes home, but he suddenly hears wailing as he gets closer to his apartment. And we realize that the worst has happened. His daughter, Katie, has died. And so there is this connection, I think, that's being suggested by Milligan here, that Finnegan has now fallen from grace. He's done his first sin, in a way. He's committed his first sin. And immediately in the aftermath of it, his sick daughter dies. And the only reason he was committing this sin was to try to help figure out a way to get money, to help get medicine for his sick daughter. But even still, he's immediately punished by the fates, by God, by what have you. His daughter dies. He drops the whiskey bottle, the metaphor, the symbol of his sin. He drops it immediately. It shatters, and he sits down in the rain, and Finnegan sits down, and the description, I just want to read this very last bit here. The description says, he sat down and he looked up. My grandfather, he looked up at the sky, the empty, empty sky. They buried Kate Finnegan 2 days later in the blasted ruins of a forgotten church. And I just want to point out how beautiful Pete Milligan's prose is. because Milligan is writing in a way that is so evocative and it's so lovely, and it's a way of writing that's almost disappeared really in modern comics. And I think back in the day when Alan Moore would do this also to great effect, some people would criticize Alan Moore, and I think Alan Moore himself has joked about his tendencies toward so-called purple prose in Swamp Thing and how his descriptions would go on and on and on sometimes. But for me, I always loved that about Alan Moore. And here with Pete Milligan, I think he's striking the perfect balance because he's not overdoing it. He's not overwriting. But if you read just some of the word choices are so incredibly emotional and evocative, and he's really going for it. Like at every time where there's a major shattering moment, a major emotional moment, Pete Milligan is not holding back. He's just going for it. And he's really just twisting the knife at every opportunity, emotionally and intellectually. The story's working on so many levels, but I think that the narration and the way that he allows the narrator to speak in such singular language, I think is a big part of how this story kind of sticks to your ribs, because it's like poetry at times. It's like brutal, harsh, awful poetry. You know what I mean? Just the same way when you read Clockwork Orange and you read the way Anthony Burgess kind of writes out certain sentences and certain things, it's the poetry that I think really helps it work. And I think it's a lot easier to kind of hide behind like, oh, just let the artist handle it. Let the artist do everything. Let the artist convey the sadness. Let the artist do. And I think, sure, the artist is going to do their share, but I think Pete Milligan is not shirking his duty as the writer here. He is showing up with some incredible turns of phrase that for me, a lot of them were just devastating. Like there's moments in here where just the language itself is just so brutal, and it's a big part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you make a good point. Is that in terms of the balance of how much it's not that he's giving description. I mean, look, he's describing emotional states of the characters, and that I think look, this is in this age when the thought balloon was disappearing, or had probably fully disappeared, and I think that it's sometimes I think that was a good thing to have in comics, is because you get it in novels all the time, but I feel that it might have been somewhat. I guess it got to the point where it's somewhat obtrusive in comics because of like where you're going to put the thought balloon, but usually these kind of like like these boxes of description, they usually go, I mean, some people obviously like I remember like in not Dark Knight, but in Sin City, like Frank Miller will have like a whole panel that's just description about stuff, but you're right. It's like the word choice and how he's trying to like to channel you into the story more, and make you feel like what this guy is going through. Just the rest of them. I mean, it's not just Finnegan, but everyone what they're going through, because there's a certain amount of the acting that you can't get in the drawings. It's one of these things that I talk about on my other podcast about how how filmmakers use music to say what the images can't say, and there's times where you just can't, like you can't get anyone's like so they'll use music to be like what's the to help push the internal state of a character. And I think that's what he does so well in this book, so we understand again what people are like suffering through, because there's a lot of suffering in this, and I don't think there's anyone who like who escapes a high degree of suffering that that might break most people. It's interesting you say that he makes this comment about this is the first sin that he makes, and again it goes back to that choice he made in the first issue not to let those girls get sold into slavery, and every choice he has to make to see, it's like, what, he chose to save other people, not his family, and now his family suffers from every choice that he now makes, and it's letting it's like, well, are you better off being selfish and saving your own family, or are you trying to be like to protect the greater good? Like what can we? Because you think about a society like this, a society like this, like only collapses when everyone gets to be too selfish. And that's what I think is what he's kind of like exploring a lot. Again, it's a great thing to do to show the average Joe what he or she is having to go through, like in this world that's just so tragically brutal.
Oh
I
God.
mean,
Yeah, suffering. Suffering is the right word. Like everyone suffers. Everyone suffers so horribly. Like, and I could see someone calling the story nihilistic and, you know, just so hopeless and violent and brutal. But there really is also just this this aspect of religion and yearning for something better that is represented by Finnegan and the characters who are really trying desperately to have some goodness and some moral grounding in their life. But ultimately, Milligan's asking hard questions here. He's forcing everyone reading this to try to put themselves in the shoes of these characters and just ask yourself, yeah, what would you do if you had a sick daughter who needed medicine and now you're being faced with this choice of, do you piss off these brutal gang lords so that your sick daughter can get medicine? I mean, or no, do you do what the brutal gang lords want you to do so that, but then by doing so, destroy the lives of these other innocent girls, and in so doing save your daughter? Or do you do the right thing, quote unquote, and like, yeah, sure, you free these people and you don't sell them into a life of slavery? Of course that's the right thing, but then by doing that, you're dooming your own daughter to death.
Yeah.
You're dooming your own daughter to a life where now she's not going to get medicine and you're going to be in danger and these gang lords are coming after you. It's a fucking horrible Sophie's Choice predicament.
Constantly.
That
Constantly,
yeah,
Sophie's Choice.
constantly. And this poor character, Finnegan, it's going to get worse for him.
It's going to get
Like, it's
way
just-
worse for him. It's going to get it's
just-
going to get so worse that it's hard. I mean, we'll get to it. It's just you know,
Yeah.
I mean, there's the Skreemer story. Well, the Skreemer story in this is you kind of see his rise. You know, like you see him as a kid, like take out a Skreemer, you know, and assume that guy's identity in the Tiberius White organization, you know, and what he's doing, and you know, and this is the first time that you know that Dutch like runs in on him and Vicky and Skreemer, Vito like having sex. But again, you know, I mean, and you just see these things he's trying to make and the choices that they're. I mean, that scene in the last couple pages where you know that Vicky's trying to explain to Dutch about you know what she did, you know, like sex she had with him. Like, yeah, we're good friends. So it's one of those interesting things. It's kind of like, you know, she knows that it's like Dutch is in the friend zone with her, you know, and maybe he wants to be there. I mean, not that he wants to be, but maybe he's okay with it, with being there, or maybe he's not, because sometimes like you get too close with a woman and it's like, you know, like I can't, you know, have that sexual relationship with her because then it'll really muddle the waters because we had so much going on, like just as a friendship. But it's but you see how it kind of takes a toll on Dutch. One thing interesting I want to point out about Dutch, he's black, and I think he's the only person of color in the entire series, you know, which is interesting.
I think that is true. I think you're right, actually. Yes. And that is an interesting choice that's made by Milligan here. Yeah. How did you feel about that in terms of Dutch's character and like the choice for him to be the one black character? Like, how did that hit you? Because it is an interesting choice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not something that I kind of even thought about to me like the issues 3 or 4, and I was like, oh, there's somebody else black here. This guy is like he's being used as a fulcrum to, you know, like whatever. He's a pawn in the game of a lot of people. And I mean, and it's almost like he's got no agency like on his own. And when he does have some choices to make, you know, he doesn't make the right choices. And you know, the rest of the time he's just being victimized because he's friends with, you know, these power hungry white people. And I think it might have been different if there were other, you know, people of color throughout the book, because there's none. Like it really stands out, you know. And obviously that we said earlier on when you meet him the first time, it's like there's that he's that Christ imagery of him, and it's you're kind of like, you know, is he being sacrificed for the, well, you know, he's definitely being sacrificed for these other people to try to find out like who they are. I mean, it is tough going, you know, it's tough going because it's that, you know,
to say the least. It's a weird thing, man. It actually reminds me of something I heard you talking about also on Screenwriters Rant Room. I think it was, or maybe it was offline. But I remember when you were talking about Promising Young Woman, how I think it was like the one black character in Promising Young Woman was treated in a way that felt like just a little bit more humiliating than the other guys that Carey Mulligan's character encounters in that story. That like he starts crying and runs away as a reaction to her, which was different than any of the other characters had to Carey Mulligan doing sort of crazy wild shit.
Yeah, it's something that I kind of like. I mean, it's something that I pick up on. You know, obviously as a black man, the depiction of black men in certain narratives that, you know, don't revolve around them. And I mean, particularly in that movie, because it's kind of like, you know, and that movie was like extra disappointing for me because it's like you have this woman who's writing this story about like female empowerment and female victimization, and I think it's something that goes on a lot with oppressed classes, is because there's an interesting kind of like one-upmanship that goes on, which I think is incorrect,
Right.
but it does go on. It's kind of like who's oppressed more, you know, who has the worst, who has it worse. And then I just feel like, you know, that, like I said, it was like how that guy behaved. And the thing is, it's like that guy, he was coming across in a way that was very kind of like extra macho, and I feel like that was something that maybe I forget her name. I think it's like Hannah Friedel, but that's not right. But the filmmaker behind Promising Young Woman, she's British, and it's like she's making this movie, and it's like you might not know enough black men, you know, to understand that. And I'm sure that if you're white and you do know black men, they are probably doing some level of code switching just to be around you, like in a way that they know is not going to scare you off. And it's interesting you remember that, because I look at this and I'm just kind of like, you know, there could be, and this is one of the things that I always find fascinating about, you know, future stories a lot of, you know, like they have a high degree of white men in control of things. And it's just weird because it's kind of like, well, we have known for a long time that's just not going to be the case. Because I just kind of feel like even in this story, you know, there's all these extra presidents you meet and around stuff like that. And there's
Yeah,
no one
right, of
black,
course.
there's no one Asian, there's no
Yeah.
one, you know, East Asian, there's no one Hispanic,
Yes.
you know, or Latinx, whatever it is. I'm just kind of like
Yeah.
that. But now, granted, again, this is in '89 where people aren't maybe necessarily thinking about that. Who are white writers? Peter Milligan, I
Right.
believe he's from England, so he's got
Yes.
it's
Yes.
more of a. But then if he's from London, it's like, but London has been such a cosmopolitan city that it
Mhm.
seems like there's a higher degree of kind of like I'm gonna have a blinder on, you know, in a sense, because I feel like, you know, it's like it's one of those things that happens that if you're from New York City or maybe from LA or maybe from London or from Paris, those cities are so metropolitan and they're so drenched with all these other characters. Particularly, I would say like England in a different way than ever, because all those colonies of people who are living there and around you. It's like, what is the circle that you are living in, that you are kind of like, that you're purposely not engaging people of other cultures, even though they're all around you, you know?
That's a fascinating point. And it's a really great point, actually, because that to me represents one of the primary failures of imagination, I would say, with Skreemer. And I think with any science fiction story, because, you know, when you're creating a world in science fiction, like it's one thing to say like, oh, it wouldn't be realistic for, you know, the president or this gang lord in, you know, the 70s in this particular place, or in the 50s in this particular place, to be a person of color or black or Asian or whatever. But I think to say that that's not the case and that that's not possible in a future world that's a dystopian world that you're creating from whole cloth, I think that to me feels like a failure of imagination, and probably is representative, I would guess, maybe of just what you said, that it was a different time and perhaps Pete Milligan just wasn't thinking about it that carefully. And honestly, maybe he thought just by making the best friend a black dude, that in itself was going to be considered a progressive act on some level, even though if you look at that for 2 seconds, you would realize exactly what you're saying, that character is a pawn who gets his fucking face eaten off and gets crucified in the first issue. So if you're going to go for one character that's a person of color, that may not be the right one to choose. And, I remember it actually reminds me of some really great advice that I got on writing from my ex-brother-in-law, who's a brilliant filmmaker in the UK himself, named James Hendry. And he was an Academy Award-winning filmmaker years ago. And he was one of my first writing mentors. And I remember one time discussing this exact issue with him. And he's a white Englishman. And I remember talking to him when I was working on one of my first screenplays, and I was like 18, 19 years old. And I said to him, hey, so I've got this black character in the story, and they're going to be presented as like, a character who has these traits, XYZ traits. How can I make sure that like it doesn't seem like I'm trying to make some kind of statement or, tokenize this character because they're really angry in the scene, or they're really irrational in the scene, or whatever. And I remember thinking, like, how do I make it clear that I'm not intending this character to represent like some statement on all black people? I remember my brother-in-law at the time looking at me like I was stupid, and he was like, well, you should have more black characters then. Just have more than one.
Yeah.
And just fill in the world so it looks closer to the world that we're living in. And you can have, if you've got 2 or 3 black characters in the story, then yeah, one of them can be an asshole, and then one of them can be really cool or whatever. But don't just tell a story where you're just going to have one member of one ethnic group if you can avoid it. Try to populate the world in such a way, like you were saying, like, so it feels representative of the melting pot that most of the urban centers of the world, that so many places in the world really are and have been for a long time. So you're not just tokenizing anyone. And I think if Pete Milligan had done that with Skreemer, if we saw multiple presidents or other characters that were Indian, Asian, black, et cetera, then it wouldn't feel quite as glaring that the one character of color is so, rendered passive and such a victim of all these other quote unquote stronger characters around him. And I think that, to me, in talking it out, that is honestly one of my only major complaints with the story of Skreemer. I think that's one of the things that I would characterize as a shortcoming of the story that is problematic and disheartening to see, because I think the story is pushing boundaries and so progressive in so many ways. I wish that Milligan had given just a bit more thought to that one aspect, because I think it really, to me, it hurts the story looking at it today in that regard.
It's interesting because, two of my favorite science fiction films, and obviously they're the favorites of a lot of people, is Alien and is Blade Runner. And both those are directed by Ridley Scott, who is from London, England. I'm not sure necessarily where he's from in England, the UK, but I know he spent that time he's living in London. And it's like, and those two films have very, smartly drawn people of color. You got Parker in Alien, who is like one of the last guys to die. I think he's the last person to die. Like in Alien, and in in Blade Runner, you've got Gaff, who's played by Edward James Olmos. He doesn't die, and he's got an interesting role. But like all the people that he looks at in the underworld, there's Chu, who's making the eyes. There's that Arab guy who's got the snake. There's like there's an interesting kind of like bevy of people who are people of color who are in that. And I think that's what's interesting. And to me, it's like, okay, look, like those are examples of films that are done by white guys, you know, or a white guy, like at the time when everyone was saying it is problematic that there aren't people of color like in the future like that. But I think there was something saying that if you look at Blade Runner and you look at like just the extras and all those street scenes, it's this huge like mishmash of people because there's some sort of storyline going on there about the off-world colonies is where all the middle class and fucking rich white people have moved to, and it's the other races who can't afford to go there. And I mean, it's like a really like a strange reading of that movie that I've only heard maybe in the last couple of years. But you hear that talking about like, off-world colonies, and that's where they use the replicants to do stuff, and it's like that's really an interesting kind of just read of how he set that world. Again, go back to your statement about like if you're building this world out whole cloth, then you know what are your responsibilities? You know, like as the what you call it, the storytellers. Now, granted, you know, it could also be a problem with the artist with Brett Ewins because you know maybe like Peter's not you know thinking about they say about this main story and it's really maybe Brett who should have been saying, hey, I'm going to draw these other gangsters this way, you know, here and there and just populate it out the way that I mean it's just I mean look, you see so many gang scenes that it's like how hard it would have been to put an Arab in there, to put an Asian person in there, to put you know someone else black in there, you know, like I mean it's just interesting to see how that was not I mean I'm just curious to see, I'd be curious to know like that choice and things like that because
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. It's a really good point and a good question because obviously representation was not something that was talked about in the same way back then. And it just, I would guess it might have just been something that nobody thought of and they just didn't really think twice about it because the default back then in storytelling was just like, oh, well, all the characters are white unless you've got some reason to make them black or Asian or whatever. I still remember when I first took screenwriting classes. I mean, you probably remember this too, that it was considered just de facto the norm that you didn't have to mention that your characters were white because that was assumed.
Yeah.
The only time in a script, and I was taught this, I was literally taught this by screenwriting teachers when I took classes, that you were not supposed to mention the race of your characters unless they were non-white.
Yeah.
Because literally it was like the assumption is of course they're white, who else would we be telling stories about? And oh yeah, if there's an exception to that, well then yeah, obviously you need to call that out. Like that was literally the thinking back then, and now thank God it's 180 degrees different. But I just say that to illustrate for anyone who wasn't alive or writing stories or reading stories back then, that was just the default, and it's sad, but I think that certain stories suffer through that prism when you look at it in 2021. Having said that, I think that we've, we're doing our usual incredibly languid job of trying to summarize a story. So I guess we'll keep summarizing as we slowly walk through this. But I do want to mention that we haven't talked enough probably about the art of Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon here.
Yes.
And Brett Ewins is sadly passed away and has it's really unfortunate. And I think he died younger than he should have. But my goodness, what a tremendous job he did on the visuals here overall. I really feel like him and Steve Dillon, they brought a lot to the table here, and it's a really well crafted and sharply drawn comic book that just it works as a story. The storytelling is fairly impeccable, and Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon are legends in UK comics. They were some of the early 2000 AD artists. They also launched the significant seminal UK comics magazine Deadline, which of course birthed such iconic characters as Tank Girl. And it was also the place where Jamie Hewlett, who drew Tank Girl and went on to co-found the Gorillaz, got his start.
Mm-hmm.
Deadline was a magazine that I fucking loved as a kid. And I was lucky enough because I would go visit my my brother-in-law and my sister who were living in the UK at that time and spend time over there. When I was in high school, was right around the time Deadline launched. And I just ate that shit up when I was over there. And so Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon, they founded Deadline magazine, and so these guys are giants themselves in the world of UK comics art. And sadly, they're both passed away now. And of course, Steve Dillon went on to draw Preacher, and that was a
Yeah,
massive
yeah. I
series
mean,
as
yeah. I mean,
well.
and that's his probably biggest claim to fame. I mean, the thing about the art in this is, it's very polished, but there's still kind of like a roughness to it to reflect the world that is being depicted. I mean, and
Yes.
it's also, but it's also, it's very clean in terms of like compositions. Like there's never a moment where you're reading this book where you can't follow the story visually, or that you don't know what's happening in a panel, or that you can't read someone's emotional state with the way that their face is drawn, or that there's or
Yes.
or just or the way they're positioned. Like there's a lot of interest. I mean, in issue 3, there's that moment where Dutch takes the bandages off his face for the first time, and it's like, you're looking at in this, and it's always these shots from behind, and there's that one shot of seeing the face, but it's like he's sitting on the bed and he's like he can't face himself, and it's just this, it's just, there's that acting that he does, that Brett does so well, like in this, and just also the way that he draws Skreemer, like Skreemer, like he's physically larger than life,
Yes.
but not to the point where it's a caricature. But his clothing helps with kind of like expand his
Yeah.
stature. You get these weird
You're
ass
right
kind
about
of
that.
shoes on that feel like there's these the like combination of like Spats and Doc Martens. It's like some wild ass shit, man. Yeah. Well, that shot there at the end of that splash panel at the end of
End of issue
issue
one.
one is like he's in this like big white fur coat with this huge ass like Tommy gun, like amped up Tommy gun, this hat, this tie, that skinny ass tie, which was, I guess, was coming back then. It's just really, it's something else. Like the just the production design of this comic and what Brett did and how he, when Steve Dillon is the inker, I mean, he's doing a lot to help us, like, I'd be curious to see, what this, like these original comic pages like would look like pre-colored.
Yeah, I'd be fascinated. I'd be fascinated because I feel like I can see some Steve Dillon in some of this in terms of the faces and whatnot, and just sort of the long faces. But I'm not sure how much of that really is also just Brett Ewins, because I have to say personally, I far prefer the work of Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon as a team over, for me personally, the work of Steve Dillon on Preacher, because although I really respect what Ennis and Dillon did with Preacher, visually for me, I did not love Steve Dillon's style on Preacher. And it's interesting because I find myself actually being a much bigger fan of Steve Dillon's work when he was very young. And he did really early stories, and he broke into comics like he was kind of a savant. I think he broke into comics when he was in his teens, and he did some very early work for 2000 AD. He did a series that was later republished and repackaged by Eclipse Comics that was called, I think it was like Axel and Press Button. It was like Laser Eraser, Axel and Press Button, had some crazy title like that. And that was drawn by an extremely young Steve Dillon. And for me, I kind of prefer the younger Steve Dillon work as far as Steve Dillon periods go. But I think working in tandem with Brett Ewins, this for me is something that actually I find quite compelling and quite striking. So I love what Brett Ewins is bringing to this. I think it's really phenomenal work. Like you say, the storytelling is just so exquisite, and you are able to track so many storylines, so many characters. And there was never a moment in these 6 horrific, deeply disturbing issues, there was never a moment that I was confused.
No,
And
no.
really, that's impressive for a story with so many conflicting storylines, dozens of characters. It's a masterful feat of artistic storytelling to be able to convey all that with clarity.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The colorist named Tom Ziuko.
Yeah.
He is, he's not listed on the cover. Perhaps he should be, because
Yeah, it's amazing color. Amazing
because
color.
the color, it's amazing what he does stuff, but the color also helps us track what time period we're in. Because like you see, the modern day thing is full colored, kind of like these garish colors. the flashbacks with Skreemer and Dutch and Vicky is just like it's like a sepia tone, and then the flashbacks with Finnegan's family it's a different type of sepia tone. It's like a pale orange, is like the highlight to like a darker brown as like the shadow color and the hues. Sometimes like filmmakers do this, sometimes they don't. I always think it immediately helps you to, if you're flashing through time, to give me a different color palette, so I don't need to guess when we are, particularly in movies, but it helped because it helps so well in this story to reorient you. And that's something, I mean, you see it in comics a lot, but not, but this, it's not so much in superhero stuff, because there's not a lot of flashbacks or time jumping. But even when there are flashbacks, I think it would be helpful just to tell it with a different color palette, because it kind of it helps you through something. I just remember there's always this great quote from Federico Fellini about when he did his movie called Juliet of the Spirits, which was his first color film. After that, he said he kind of avoided color photography for a while, because his Juliet of the Spirits, I think, is maybe like I think it's after 8.5, so maybe looking at 65 or something like that. So color for films have been out for at least 15 years or something like that. He said, like if you get the colors wrong in a movie, it's like writing a sentence with the adjectives out of order. And I always thought that was really fascinating, because it just makes you think like, oh, you don't know how to emphasize what you're saying the right way if you don't know how to use that the right way. And it's really, and I think that in this book, it's used in such a cool way. I mean, just like you said before, starting off from the covers use such kind of like garish, it's almost like the colors they're almost kind of neon in a sense on each, the way that they do it all.
They're amazing covers. They're fucking crazy. They would pop off the racks.
Today.
These color choices are fucking wild.
Yeah. I mean, I also think it's interesting because today there's such use of computer color, right? And computer color tends to be a little muted because everyone is trying to push something that's more realistic. And, there's all this level of like trying to be like the level of shading you can do and gradients and stuff like that just make it look really, really smooth. But if you look at the cover, like if we look at the cover of issue 3, right, it's like the back, like the primary color is this pretty powerful, like deep yellow. And and then the text of the title is in this great offset red. This one of the complete kind of like like opposite on the cover wheel. But if you look at so you got Skreemer carrying this woman who was carrying his baby. I can't remember her name. Is it like Claudia or something like that? I think it's Claudia. But it's like if you look at the way she's colored, right? It's like it's white, like it's real white, and like this kind of like dirty pink. That's all that it is. And I think that today, and it's not, and Skreemer, he's not the same pink. It's close to, but not the same. Because if you look at his hands, this closer to a skin tone, and she's dead, obviously, in the cover, but it's like, but it helps with make everything pop, because it's just like 2-3 colors are going bam, bam, bam. And it's, the contrast is so stark. And I think that's something that we lose in today's coloring. With the computers. And this is obviously what 89, so they don't even have that capability yet. But yeah, it's something again that makes this book as an interesting kind of story, because this level of like of in your face like screaming the way the colors is doesn't really reflect how the interior of the book is colored,
No, not at all. That's a great point. It's a conscious choice
very
for the
conscious
cover.
choice. And it's such a really, I mean, like I said before, the interior colors are so helpful in guiding you through the story, which needs a lot of guidance because of like it's jumping around through multiple time periods so much. Like I was saying, like just like that one page in issue 2 where it's like three different time periods on one page, which is like hard to kind of to navigate, I think, as the writer, the reader, the artist. But these guys like, but they make it work in this book, which is
They really do. They really do. And you're right to call out the coloring because it is so thoughtful and smart the way that Tom Ziuko does this. And it really does remind me, as you were saying, of cinema and the way films like Traffic will have the different color palette for each storyline, just as that visual way to immediately allow the audience to fall into that time frame and track what's going on. And Zuko's doing the same thing here, and it's clearly well thought out, and it's a brilliant choice, and it helps with the readability and the clarity immeasurably because Pete Milligan, much like Mike Barron, who we talked about with Nexus, is not a writer who suffers fools gladly. And Pete Milligan keeps this shit moving, and he is jumping through so many time frames, in and out, chronologies all insane. And Zuko really helps keep this all connected and readable. And I think that Tom Ziuko is somebody we'll be talking about on the podcast again before too long, because he was a major colorist in the 80s. He colored a lot of Hellblazer, but also he colored another book that we're excited to talk about, which is Thriller, with Trevor Von Eden and Robert Loren Fleming. And that's also a really beautifully colored book as well. So Zuko, just very significant colorist from that era who I think you don't hear people talk about enough, but this is just really wonderful world-class work all around. I mean, Skreemer is a terrific package, and this is absolutely a book that I'm so happy we're talking about, Chris, because this is the kind of thing that when we were discussing launching this podcast, I was hoping we'd have long discussions about, because this is a serious piece of work.
Yeah.
Like, for all of the flaws and foibles that we absolutely could discuss and pick apart with certain aspects of it, it's a deeply considered and largely incredibly executed piece of work that I think very few comic fans today are aware of, and I've heard virtually no one talk about for the last 30 years.
But just to kind of wrap up what happens in issue 3.
Please.
So this is the ultimate choice for Finnegan, the end of this. This is the choice that breaks him. So that guy Tiberius White, who he, betrayed in issue 1, where he where he took those girls and let them go. The President White. I'm sure he's forgotten about all this because it's so many years later. But but he's now in charge of all this shit. The gang wars are over in the past, and he has kidnapped Finnegan's twins, and they're basically gonna they're basically told, you know what, you gotta fuck each other for our amusement at this big party. But
at this like fucking crazy Sodom and Gomorrah fucking wild gangster
off
party.
This party. But then Finnegan goes, he goes to rescue his kids. He gets there. He's like, he calls out the president as an animal, a complete animal who, and it's like, he's like, run to think about the choice. You know what? You've chosen to be an animal. You've chosen to be a monster. He goes, you chose to kill and maim and terrorize. And, and the Tiberius is like, fuck all that. You know what's going to happen? I'm going to have you killed too. But then Vito steps in and he's like, no, let me have these kids. And he goes to Finnegan, and he's got you. This is this line that he says is so crazy. He goes, "It's your decision. It's your choice. Are you human or are you an animal? Or are you an animal? You made it sound so easy to choose. So let me see you do it." So he gives him a blade, and he's like, "Here's your choice. You can either kill your kids, or you can kill these other 2 kids that we kidnapped. So choice is yours, son." And then it's just like, what the fuck? Like, that's, in this last page where it's like, there's these great little shots of like, it's Finnegan's face. It's these little boys who've been kidnapped. And then it's and then it's his twins. And that's like, it's like, okay, dude, that's your choice. How do you survive this choice? And that's kind of how like issue 3 ends. And you're just like, what the fuck is this? Look, there's stuff that's pretty crazy in a lot of mediums, but it's like, you kill your children so they don't have to fuck in front of people, or
this is
you kill some other kids. That's what you do.
It's insane.
It's insane.
It's wild. It's fucking insanity. And yeah, I'm looking at the pages right now, and this blew my mind reading it. I couldn't even believe this was the cliffhanger for issue 3. I think to be clear, Vito's actual choice that he gives Finnegan is, you kill these other children, and your two kids live. You don't kill them, and your children die.
Yeah.
So he's not necessarily saying he has to kill his own kids, but he's saying, if you don't kill these other 2 kids, we're going to kill your kids.
Yeah.
And so you choose. And so now what's interesting about this, and I'm glad you called this out as the cliffhanger for issue 3, is because now, up to this point, and I hadn't really thought about this till we were talking about it now, but up to this point, we've seen Finnegan have 2 moral dilemmas before this, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first one, he realized he was accidentally transporting these children into a life of sexual slavery, and he had a crisis of conscience, understandably, and he was like, fuck this shit, I'm freeing the kids, I'm not going to be a party to this. I don't care how much it risks my life or my family. This is wrong. I'm not going to be a party to this. Okay, he did that, and it sort of fucked up his family, meant that they had to go on the run. They were living in danger. They didn't have money for medicine for his sick daughter. And then the second moral sort of crossroads happened, where he needed money for the medicine for his sick daughter now, and he was willing to rob this fucking wino in the street and steal his whiskey from him because he wanted to sell it. And then the instant he did that, practically moments later, his daughter dies.
Yeah.
Right? And so, yeah, so we've had these 2 big moral crossroads where Finnegan first time did the right thing and it fucked over his family. Second time, he did the wrong thing and it still fucked over his family. And so poor Finnegan now. The question is, what's he going to do? And so as we return to this horrific moment in the next issue, Finnegan, let's see, this is issue 4.
Oh, yeah.
When do they come back to it? It's like, it's
pretty early on.
We actually don't come back to it right away, do we?
No,
I think
it's page 6. So page 6.
It's page 6. Okay, got it. So here he says, God, I can't do it. Anything else? I'll kill myself. Will that do? I'll slit my own throat, and you can let all the kids go. And then Vito Skreemer, our main character, our title character, says, you said it yourself. However bad things are, we always have a choice. Your choice was kill them or yours die. You chose not to kill them, so yours die. Life's so simple, isn't it? And then Vito points his gun at this guy's kids, and you think Vito's going to kill them, but then when we cut to a little bit later, the father is walking home on the street, and we find out from the context of the captions here, he walks home, and then slowly, trailing way after him, his own kids walk home as well, walk into his house. And we realize that the father, Finnegan, his clothes we see are now splattered in blood. His wife is like, what happened? What happened to your clothes? What happened? What happened? We realize that he reconsidered apparently at the last minute, and he decided
to kill
those
kids.
2 innocent.
And I mean,
to kill
and then what happens to him? It was crazy. What happens to him is, his his twins, they have to actually leave the family. They got to like go out west because it's basically like they can't stomach seeing their father, who kept them alive, but had to kill 2 other kids. And that's just, I mean, so again, the choice he made, the moral choice he made, destroyed his family. It's just, it just lets you know that, I mean, it chipping away at his family, it doesn't stop from there because, then they go back to that party, you pick it up, and that's when Vito takes over. That's when Vito has set it up and he kills, President White, and that's when he becomes, the top president. That's when he's no longer called the Skreemer. He's just called Skreemer, like Vito Skreemer, and
he's the one.
He's the one. There's a really nasty part where dude is like, he's licking the blood off the knife. He's like, here, come taste some. It's like, what the fuck is this, man? Like this book. it's the level of like the foulness in this. I mean,
the depravity on display here is really it's quite high. It's insane.
I mean, and throughout all the issues so far, you find out that in the future, like Vito has a woman who's pregnant with his child, and she's in childbirth, and then she meets and she befriends Finnegan's son, who's now maybe 20, and he's working for Vito, which is pretty, which obviously the dad did not like, but that's what had to happen. And so there's this little current storyline about, Vito, and and he's about his sex toy. He's about to have like his baby. And then the story kind of rolls out more, and you see that Finnegan, he can't even deal with his choice. He beats his wife, well, he slaps his wife around, and then he just like flees the family. And he goes on this 2-year odyssey where he becomes like some homeless bum and just can't even he can't even face himself. To that, really, again, we go back to the scene where he goes back to that church where he buried Katie probably like 10 years earlier or something like that. And, he meets this woman who's also kind of like, who's suffered a lot. And she kind of like shows him there's still, I know she shows him some sort of forgiveness. And it allows him then to kind of like forgive himself. There's some interesting line, I think, in a later issue where she says something about he feels that she was able to maintain some dignity.
Yeah. She held on to some shred of her spirit or something amidst every. Yeah, it's he says, I went to turn away. I was disgusted. But then I realized even though she was ravaged and ruined, there was still some part of her intact that hadn't died. And I thought that maybe all real angels are like that, just one step away from damnation. And so I thought that if there was still some spark left in this toothless hag, there was still some hope left for old Charlie Finnegan.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's,
it's fucking crazy. Yeah, it's wild. And then he comes back home after 2 years. Like, there's a great shot where it's like, it's great because there's no dialogue. It's just like you're back with the wife Carla, and there's a knock at the door, and then he's there, and then it cuts to the kid's face. The kid who's later on, maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years later, starts working for Skreemer.
The kid who's narrating the story.
No,
and that's
not him. It's actually that guy's son is narrating the story.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Which is crazy, and and then at the end of issue 4 is when these balloons get launched. That's part of Skreemer's kind of plan to kind of take over everyone. Where he supposedly has this plague like that are in these balloons. That's a really
This is nuts. This is nuts because this made me realize the story actually was a lot more relevant and contemporary in a way. I don't know if you thought this reading this, but reading this in COVID era 2021, I was like, holy fuck, this is like watching 12 Monkeys today with this whole talk of like engineered viruses and pandemics taking over the world, etc. And like, this was shocking to me to get to this part. That's probably something we should mention, that I think in the early issues, when they talk about the fall, there was mention of the plague that had happened. And that was, I think, part of why maybe his daughter was sick and needed medicine and all that. There was a plague that had been part of why the world had fallen apart. And so now these issues that we've come up to where you're talking about with the balloons, and Vito's talking about these balloons with this kind of official looking dude who turns out is some kind of a scientist sort of figure who works for him. And it's kind of unclear for the first few issues when Vito's asking about the balloons. We don't know what he's talking about. But then we find out that there's this crazy plan, this really batshit insane plan that Vito's hatched, that he's got this scientist in league with him, ready to carry out.
It's basically his plan is basically, they're saying that the age of the giants, the age of the Skreemer is all going to be over. Like, we're at that tipping point of the previous age and entering the new age, and he's trying to maintain control. So his thought is, let me bioengineer a plague, and then let me have the only vaccine for it, and I'm just going to launch it out into the world, and then people have to come and bow down to me if they want to survive, because I'll give them the vaccine. Like, that is a level of insanity. It's a level of insanity that's, again, like reading it. I mean, look, in 89, I don't think we even thinking about plagues or
not at all. I mean, this is so prescient. That's what blew me away reading it today. I was like, holy fuck.
You know what? In 89, what the last plague probably was the damn. I mean, look, there was the smallpox breakout in like New York in the 50s, but really the last plague might have been the 1918 Spanish flu. So it was 70 years. Like,
I don't know.
I mean, something that was really affecting the planet. I mean, obviously, there's all these little plagues like Ebola and stuff was popping up like in hotspots around the world, but a real, but never like an engineered man-made plague. And again, it goes back to
Totally.
certain people kind of think that COVID leaked from one of those labs in China. Whether that's true or not, people are thinking that because they're on the level of like the bioengineering is out of control, and he's
Oh
talking
yeah,
about this now.
and it's certainly a real possibility. And Pete Milligan was way ahead of the curve thinking about this kind of stuff, and yet he combines it with comic books in a way that I think is so brilliant and lovely. As you mentioned, and we were talking about the balloons. Like apparently, the way that Skreemer and this scientist of his have decided that they're going to launch this insane bioengineered virus into the world is by releasing just, I guess, hundreds of thousands of balloons into the air. And these balloons have designs on them that frankly look kind of like Captain America's shield.
Yeah, a lot like Captain America's shield. Yeah.
Yeah. And these balloons, and it's such a weird pop art, absurd comic booky decision. And the cover to issue number 5 is another brilliant cover where you see a silhouette, sort of side profile, partial silhouette of Skreemer's face with all of these balloons, just countless balloons going out into the sky behind him. And this is the masterstroke of his final plan to stop himself from becoming obsolete. He doesn't want to be a dinosaur. He wants to be the one and only gangster who rules everything. And this virus that's going to be launched into the world by balloons containing bacteria.
Yeah.
This is how he's going to fucking take over. And this is such a creative, weird way to do it. It's so fucking funny.
Yeah, I mean, and this is an interesting issue again. Like as some of the storylines keep pushing forward. It's like there's more of the story about. So this is like when with Finnegan's story, his son, who he had another son. Maybe his wife was too old when she had this. I don't know. He's pretty old and he has this child, but he's not able to be a good father to this son, because he's witnessed so much terribleness, and he's kind of putting like a lot of he's hanging too many dreams and hopes, like on this son this is the son who later works for Skreemer, and it's like the kid is like suffering under the weight of his father's problems and guilt and the consequences he's taken. Then later on, it's like there's that really interesting thing halfway through the book where it's like they're just walking, and they get mugged. And Finnegan can't make a choice about to save his own wife because he's like, he's kind of like, I don't know how to make choices anymore because if I make the wrong choice. Well, no, it doesn't matter what choice I make. Bad's just gonna happen to me.
Yes.
And he gets kind of paralyzed. And then his son Tim, who's the guy who works for Skreemer, he saves his mother, Finnegan's wife, from the. He hits him with a brick and then chases them off. But the look that he gives his dad, like, you're such a weak bitch,
Yeah, totally.
But the thing is, Tim doesn't know what his dad is going through. He might know a little bit about it, but he doesn't know enough about. He wasn't even born when he made the choice about the little girls, and I think he was just a little baby when the thing about the twins. So it's like he doesn't know the deal with his dad really, and it's just like interesting. It's just the way the storyline keeps wrapping up, And then there's more of this stuff with Vicky as she's trying to like do, she's trying to consolidate power. She's trying to, she gets voted to be the president of the presidents, so she's the top dog. But this other president named Richter, tries to kill her. And there's this interesting scene where he's attempting to rape her. And there's this scene
again, the sex and the violence constantly being joined.
And he has this great thing where he's talking about, like, this is the thing that he says. This is like, he's like, oh, this is a lesson of leadership. Don't let your enemies survive. And then he gets in this thing about, how he thinks that women aren't strong enough to lead. And he says, he goes, hey, there's a gun between us, Vicky, but I don't need it. Why? Because I'm stronger than you. That's why men will always have over women, because when they're alone, when the trappings are gone, when things are stripped naked, and naked is like all is bolted out. It's the man who's got the muscles and the balls, and that's why that's what they call the law of the jungle, sweetheart. And then he kicks her in the jaw. you know. But
Fucking brutal.
brutal, you know. And then but then he's pantsing out. He's getting ready to rape. It's not enough he's gonna kill her. He's gonna rape her first, you know. But then he realizes that this rabid dog comes and he emptied that gun. So then he can't use the gun to save off the dog, and then the dog just like rips his throat out. What I thought was going to happen when the dog comes was, which would have been more fitting, because he said earlier that's why that men have the muscle on the balls. I thought the dog like would have gone after this guy's genitals and ripped off his dick first before killing him, but that's not what happens.
I'm surprised they didn't go for that, considering the world of Skreemer. Maybe that was like the tiny bit of editorial oversight.
Hey, man,
maybe that was the original.
You got to calm this down a little bit. I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, you know. And then there's, you know, and then you kind of get some sense of like how Baxter's Skreemer story. He starts telling Dutch about there's no free will. How that he just has a sense of like he is a slave to destiny. And it doesn't matter, like what happens. But he feels like if he has a child, things will be different. He's got this great line. He's like, if I have a child, then things would be different. The chains would be gone. I'd be free. Here's a great line. It'd be like giving a eunuch his balls back. And I was like, fuck, like that's some genius level writing.
Yeah.
He's saying, and and then it's more of this stuff where the plague storyline keeps going, and it's just like, and you get a sense of like this was where the craziness happens. Was that the one guy named Macadam, who was the bioengineer guy, he tells Skreemer, I betrayed you because you wanted me to betray you.
This fucking blew me away. This shocked me. This was a crazy twist.
There's this story. The turn in this issue is he says, you even told me one time when you were drunk or sleeping or whatever it was that you wanted me to false this thing and to forget about. Like it almost kind of sets up.
You wanted me to like falsify the bacteria and like just kind of play along with what you're saying, but not really do it.
Like it's interesting because it reminds me of, and again, this is probably what Warren Ellis took from this, is that in Planetary, what's his name, Elijah Snow, he puts in place something where he forgets who he is to save himself. When it's like that, like he's the fourth man in Planetary, and he's forgotten about that, and it's like this big kind of conspiracy of how he's going to find that. And again, it's one of these things where it's like, you didn't know what you were doing, but you were putting in a failsafe to protect the future because you knew how crazy you were,
Oh, right.
And then he starts telling Dutch about, there's no choice and I'm just a victim of destiny. He starts getting into it a little more, and then he starts telling you, this is a great little way this story ends. He goes, I want to tell you about the first person I ever killed, Dutch. And Dutch is like, just, shut the fuck up and let me just, like not live around you. It's almost like this Dutch is just here to hear Skreemers be his mother.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. It's really...
But it's a great line.
Super unfortunate.
But he goes, I want to tell you about the day I killed my mother. That's final line.
That's
the 5.
Talk about a last page. Cliffhanger. Let me tell you about how I killed my mother.
It's like, fuck, man. It's like, is this Norman Bates or what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah.
Not Norman Bates, but it's Norman Bates, but it's that line from I keep thinking that line from Blade Runner, like with Leon. He's like, my mother. Let me tell you about my mother. And then he like shoots the guy. It's like, it's pretty wild. It's such a wild story. This whole thing is it
really is, man. Like you said earlier, Chris, like it still has the power to shock, and we're 30 years on, and like motherfucker, Pete Milligan and Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon, they were pushing the envelope so far back then that if this was published today, well, first of all, it wouldn't be published. But if it was, people would freak out and people would be extremely upset with whoever published it for a variety of reasons. Now, having said that, I want to kind of disambiguate that briefly and also kind of piggybacking on what you said from the real problems that do exist with the book in terms of the depiction of Dutch and like, the the fact that the one person of color is such a passive figure who gets his fucking face chewed off at the beginning. And then also, I think in addition to that unfortunate aspect, there's also the fact that the one woman character of Vicky, while she's treated, I would say, better than Dutch, she still ultimately is kind of a very supporting character who is more passive. And in the moments where she could have stepped up and been a little bit more aggressive, I also found myself disappointed in that scene with the dog. Although Vicky gets a great line when the dog sort of starts attacking the dude and she says, "Enjoy your jungle, asshole," which is a nice final line. I felt like that was a missed opportunity because I wanted Vicky to be the one who somehow saves herself and is strong enough as a character to engineer her own survival instead of just sort of the deus ex machina of like, oh, at the last minute, a rabid dog chews this guy up. I wanted Vicky to have more agency there, and I thought that was unfortunate. So I do think there are some threads of latent, just, I don't know. I don't want to call it straight up racism or straight up misogyny because I don't think I don't necessarily know that that's fair per se, but I do feel like it's the fact that the black characters and the women characters, people of color, they're not being given sort of full freight to be full stewards of their own destiny. And I think that's unfortunate. So while I want to be careful, like not leveling any kind of accusation per se, I do think in the light of day in 2021, this is something that the story suffers for, is if the depiction of women and people of color had been more forward thinking. And I think you used the word responsibility earlier, Chris, when you were talking about this, that artists and storytellers who are telling stories about the future do have a responsibility. And I think that's the correct word. I think there is a responsibility to think beyond the bounds and the constrictions of your current societal moment. And so that's why I do think it's offensive when I look back at the old Spirit stories by Will Eisner, and he's got the Spirit sidekick, Ebony White, who's a horrific sort of black caricature, kind of a minstrel-like character. I think that's a huge mark and a huge stain on the name of Will Eisner. And I think it's really unfortunate, frankly, that the comics industry's major awards are named after Eisner for that reason, because Eisner was not forward thinking enough in terms of his depiction of race. And I think that while Milligan doesn't do anything anywhere near as egregious as what happened there with Eisner, and of course it was a different time, I do think there are creators who had the capability to be more forward thinking in certain ways. And so I kind of wish that thought had been there here a little bit more with the women and people of color, because I do think the story is so brilliant on so many levels that I hate that we have to kind of give that caveat now in talking about it. But I think I also want to take the story seriously and take Pete Milligan, Brett Ewins, and Steve Dillon all seriously as creators and as artists. And I think to do that, and part of our whole concept with the show, is that this is work that needs to be reckoned with. A lot of these forgotten, quote unquote, forgotten comics from the 80s. And I think they need to be reckoned with for good, bad, and in between, and sort of looked at in the light of day in terms of what's brilliant and what's amazing. And then also, yeah, what are the things where contemporary storytellers look at it and say, yeah, you know what, we could do better in these aspects. And it's not fair to them. And I don't think it gives proper respect to the creators to just shrug it off and say like, oh, it was just the times, you know, who could have known better? Well, like Jack Kirby knew better than Will Eisner back in the day. Jack Kirby didn't draw characters that look that way. And so I think it's not enough to just say like, oh, no one could have known. I think you have to like look at the work and just ask like, what's the responsibility that where the artist fell short? And I think that's the one part here about Skreemer that bums me out, because I think the story is so brilliant in, you know, virtually every other way.
It's interesting you say that, because, you know, there is that one issue of like, was it weird fantasy or weird science, whatever, that one really famous like EC comic that I think that Ray Bradbury wrote, where it's like that black guy, that black astronaut goes to that society, and like there's an Asimov story about that too, yeah. Where it's like, you know, there were people at the time who were, you know, trying to shine a lens on the way society was injusticing things. I mean, look, you're definitely right. It's interesting that, that again, Karen Berger and Shelley like Roberg Bond were editing this, because like I feel like, why didn't they
say in that scene where Vicky's she's being victimized. I mean,
Yeah.
look, here's a quick fix on that, right? It's like,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, so but the quick fix is you show me the dog and it's like chewing on something right when that scene begins, like in terms of like when Richard pulls her out of the thing, they have their little fight and blah blah blah. He makes that he makes that line about like we got the balls and the muscle to make these choices, and then you just show like, oh, here's the dog, like whatever it is, like there's the shot where they hear the dog, right? They hear the dog. I mean, to me, the next panel is, why isn't she, and his face, and he's turned away from her. It's like, so on page 16, he's turned away from her. Well, you know what the thing to do is, she kicks him in the balls right there. And then he stumbles, and that is what allows the dog to jump on him the way that it is.
Because, she could kick him in the balls, and she could grab the gun, and she could shoot him once if she wants, and then let the dog chew on him for a while. Like, she could have taken a lot more agency in that moment.
It could have been really simple. Just it's just two panels. It's like, oh, that panel on the bottom, it's like she's like sees, like, to me the thing would be a shot of, we're looking over her shoulder, like looking at him, and he's not looking at her anymore. And then the next panel is her foot is connecting like with his nuts. And then in the next page, it can be the exact same thing. That's when the dog jumps, because he's been kind of like, I guess at that point he's like probably bending over, and he's in the eyes of a dog. Oh, that's somewhat subservient matter, so.
Yeah.
Then so then I can jump at you and eat you. I mean, it's really simple, but I mean, the thing is, it's like, I just kind of feel like he could have had a little, I get the Finnegan thing with the Finnegan's Wake, so that character's got to be white because that's like the Irish background, but
right.
Even the guy, the scientist guy named Macadam,
could have easily been a black dude. Easily,
like, he could have been black, he could have been Asian. It just would have been like
could have been Indian,
a quick pop, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this feels a little different,
Totally true.
But
totally true.
Yeah. So, it's interesting to say that. So then it takes us up to issue 6, which is, that we get to this whole thing about why, this is the unraveling of Skreemer's kind of motivation and how he operates. You get this sense that, the first person he killed is his mom, but not through murder, but just through childbirth. Like, he killed mom by being born, and the father can't cope with it because it's like his mistress is what it is. He's already married. He's killed his first wife, and then he's gonna throw Skreemer as a baby like down like off this banister, and he's probably gonna fall like 5 stairs. Like, that's some more criminal, just brutal kind of like tease of an image, But you get this sense that the Skreemer's like, I have a magic ability. So this kind of dovetails into superhero comics in a way where it's like, he's like, I can see the future. I've been able to see what my destiny is. And all these events that have happened, I knew they were going to happen. I knew this was going to happen to you, right now. I mean, he's like spelling out how Dutch is going to behave and stuff like this. And he just tells this interesting story about how, he's walking around and he's like seeing, people in his life and why he did do things and didn't do things. Like, this great thing where he says, like, his father, like, he's able to read, is a divination from like intestines and blood and shit like that.
Yeah. Which is so insanely creative. I mean, wild. This is wild. And his dad was a pathologist and dealt with dead people. And so he talks about his father, and like his father was like doing autopsies and shit like this, and how his father, even the moment that Skreemer was conceived, was when his dad brought a prostitute back to his place of work where there were corpses, and he and this prostitute, they fucked on a slab where there were corpses all around them, and that's how Vito Skreemer was conceived.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's just,
geez, talk about a birth story.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and then and then the story just kind of rolls out with the rest of what's happening. I mean, you know, and Skreemer has this vision about how he's supposed to die and who's supposed to carry his baby and stuff like that, you know, and he's having this whole argument with Dutch, and Dutch is just questioning, you know, why are you even telling me this? Like at this point, like, so you let me get my face eaten off because you don't even believe in choice. You think that everything is predestined. And it was interesting because, you know, like he's not making like Skreemer's not making any choices throughout. In his mind, he's making no choices throughout this whole life. He's letting the river of destiny take him to where he's supposed to be. And that is like counter to what these other people think. Like, no, dude, you can make choices to live or die. And you know, and that's all cross cutting with Vicky, like taking, like she's storming like Skreemer's his palace, this weird ass palace, and Skreemer, it's all playing out the way he said it was going to play out until he runs and he gets shot in his arm and he makes this jump. He's shot by Vicky, which he saw like 20, 30 years ago. He knew this was going to happen.
Yes.
But and he's supposed to fall to his death, but he doesn't fall to his death. He survives, and it shocks him, and he's like, "Oh my God, I am able to now break the cycle of life that I've seen." And there's this great shot like on page 22 where he's like smiling in this car as he's escaping.
Yes.
And it's kind of like you never see him smile or show any emotion throughout the whole book except for on these 2 pages, you know. And this is when, you know, like when Timmy Finnegan is with, you know, like the woman who Skreemer's as the sex toy, what's her name, is like Laureen to bear his child. And then the child, you think the child's not going to be born, but it is born, and it's not, and it's not a stillbirth, but he shows the child to Skreemer, and Skreemer's broken. And and then the woman's like, look at this.
Apparently, yeah, she's like, take your monster away.
Yeah, take it away. And he like leaps to his death with the baby in his arms. And
so nuts.
What's crazy is, as brutal as this book is, there's that scene where that someone's had their intestines pulled out, where they're hanging by a meat hook, and the face getting eaten off, and they're not going to show us what the baby looks like.
Yeah, it's a really interesting choice. Like, actually, now that you mention it, yeah, you're right.
Don't show us the baby's what it looks like, and he leaps to his death, and the baby, and he dies, and the baby dies. Obviously, the baby dies, and you find, you know, and then you find out that, you know, that Vicky becomes the king, president of the presidents. She's kind of trying to reconcile with Dutch, but he's like, "Bitch, I ain't got time for you," and he just steps. He's never, and again, he's got no real agency. Like this is the scene where if he wants to be the man, he shoots her in the back of the head, you know, and he becomes king. But that's not what it is. And then the final page is, you know, when the second final beat is Timmy Finnegan has brought, you know, this sex toy from Skreemer to his house, and he kind of nurses her back to health and falls in love with her, and she has the baby who is telling the story. And it's crazy because we never meet the narrator. It's crazy.
That's so wild. You're right. That's really a fascinating choice. And then it brings it all back to Finnegan's Wake and the sort of the song and the book by James Joyce, but the actual song here that has been this recurring motif throughout the whole story. And like the last few lines of the story kind of point to how literary this is. And to me, that's one of the more just compelling things about this, is what a interesting and unique mashup this is between such a literary approach to storytelling with all the allusions to Joyce, etc., and something just so horrifically violent. It really does feel like Clockwork Orange is one of the only comparables I can kind of think of that sort of brings to mind some of this, just this combination of, you know, intellect and a literary tradition crashing into something that's dystopian and brutal and sci-fi. But at the very end, it's like our narrator has something of like a happy ending here, where he says, and now it's told, I can leave. I can dream of my grandparents. I can visit my mother and father. I can pick up my own child. I can struggle with Vico and Joyce and get drunk when I have to. I can sing the song my father and grandfather taught me, our song, the song of death and life and birth, of drunks and whores, and the good and the bad, and all the stuff in between. And Skreemer, free will, God, destiny, life. Like, I love that Milligan is just like laying out all of his themes on the table here at the very end, in case we didn't know what the story was about, which we do. But I love that he just kind of lays it all out here. Free will, God, destiny, life. What does it all mean? My grandfather would say, life goes round in circles and is far too complicated to understand. I would say, I'm just a singer. And isn't it the truth I've told you? Lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. And the last image we get is a full page image of Vito Skreemer in all of his glory, dressed to the nines, dead on the ground with a huge pool of blood behind him, clutching the baby that he's waited his whole life to have born, that was supposed to be his salvation, but turned out to be a monster that we never got to see. And now Vito and his little monster are both dead on the ground, and our lovely, happy little story is over.
Yeah.
and that, ladies and gentlemen, is Skreemer.
You know what? I just want to take a look back. I want to see if he does something interesting. No, not okay. I just want to see if he ended every issue with a shot,
a full page.
Well, no, a shot of Skreemer, but he doesn't. It's only a few of them. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he. I mean, it's the first issue and the last issue, and issue 5. But it's interesting. Look, this is such a. I mean, look, part of our impetus for doing this podcast to showcase books that people might have forgot of that they probably should want to read. Like now that like 30 years of comics is a lot. In those 30 years, so many more comics have been published in the 30 years, since the golden age began, whatever it is. I mean, you back up 30 years to 59, it's like, that's right when Marvel's getting ready to start. And it's like, there was a bunch of comics published then, but the number of comics published since 1989, the breadth, there's no Image yet. There's like Dark Horse is still kind of small on the table. There's no Aftershock, there's no Boom, there's none of this stuff. And no IDW, no Valiant. So it's kind of like, it's an interesting time to see what is published. In a Comic-Co and Eclipse had collapsed at this point. So it's really only Marvel and DC, just maybe some of those other books like Fantagraphics. I think First is still around, or they're about to collapse soon. But it's interesting to see like what is published at DC Comics, not at Vertigo yet. They're putting this out, as part of our talk about, like trying to get Jeanette Kahn on because she's like the publisher at the time. And it's like, this is one of these things that she had to agree to. She had to she had to start.
I wonder, oh my God, if we get to talk to Jeanette Kahn at some point, I cannot wait to ask her if she actually read Skreemer. And if she read Skreemer, what the hell she thought of it. Because I do remember hearing that another incredibly provocative book that they published around this time that we probably will also end up talking about was the horror anthology Wasteland. And I remember reading, I think the editor of Wasteland, Mike Gold, talked about how Jeanette Kahn read one of the early issues that had a particularly offensive story, as many of them were with Wasteland, and she hated it so much that she said she was never going to read another issue of Wasteland, and she regretted publishing it, I believe, on some level. But to her credit, she let the series keep going, and she let Mike Gold and John Ostrander and the rest, she let them kind of run with it, even though she was horrified once she realized what they were doing, and it was not to her particular taste. I still think that's the mark of a hell of a brave publisher to just say, look, maybe I'm not going to like everything we publish. Maybe I'm even going to hate it. But I trust the creative integrity and instincts of the people I've hired. And you know what? Like, I'm going to gamble on this and take some chances. And I wonder if it was a similar thing with Skreemer, if she read this at all, because I can't imagine a fairly significant percentage of people reading this not being kind of horrified and just thinking, what the hell are we publishing? Like, why are we doing this?
Again, there's a lot of stuff.
And I don't mean that as a condemnation of Skreemer. I just mean in terms of corporate comics, it is very rare to see something push the envelope the way this does.
Again, like pre-Vertigo, where I'm sure the mandate on Vertigo was, look, some of this is going to really push, is going to be controversial. but this is before that.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
you say to yourself, okay, so you wrote this and you publish it, and does she read the whole book? Does she look at the first 3 pages of issue 1 and go, I'm out. I'm checking out.
Totally.
I'm checking the
Totally.
fuck out of this because y'all gonna just take me on a ride that like I don't need to go to. And again, you know, I got this when I was a teen. I don't know how many comic shops are like enforcing that for mature readers thing and not letting like, you know, because they really can't because they're just trying to make a buck, you know, and just so
Exactly.
they're gonna let
Yeah.
anybody buy whatever they want because it's such a niche medium. It's such kind of like niche publishing, you know, where it's not like at a bookstore where you know someone's gonna get launched in hardcover and paperback and it's gonna make a bunch of money and if you're in there then you're gonna bring like there's all other type of readers who are gonna come into like a Barnes and Noble at the time or B Dalton's where the hell it was at the time. But your comic shop is such a unique audience that it's like you can't enforce these kind of like, you know, don't read this if you're under 17 kind of thing. But obviously this is a book that needed that. But it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. My comic shop when I was a kid certainly did not enforce that because I bought Skreemer off the rack, like we were talking about, and I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. And I absolutely was able to buy this. I think, if I recall, I think Skreemer may have been a book that did actually get some comic shops in trouble. I have a vague memory of reading an article in the Comics Journal where I remember they were talking about some books that had gotten some retailers shut down or investigated by police. And I think, if I recall, Skreemer might have been one of them because I remember the Journal publishing this particular image of the crucifixion of Dutch where the rat eats his face from issue 1 of Skreemer. I remember this being published in the Journal, and it was part of this story on sort of like problems that DC was having with some of their books. And I think, in fact, that might have even been the reason why DC ultimately told Rick Veitch that he couldn't do this last story he wanted to do on Swamp Thing, where Swamp Thing went to go and met Jesus at the crucifixion. And if I recall, Veitch, he quit or was fired around that time, and they took Swamp Thing out of his hands because he had this final story that he wanted to do where Swamp Thing meets Jesus on the cross. And I don't know, I think it was right around this time, and I think that perhaps Skreemer and some other books might have caused some trouble at DC. We'll have to go back and like look and do some of the research.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, you have to say to yourself, comics are showing up in the Bible Belt, you know, and if this is coming up in the Bible Belt or just or anywhere small town America, then there's going to be those decency claims and indecency, you know, because this is a time like I don't think I think the NC-17 rating was coming out around this time. I think that movie, what you call it, there was that movie about Anise Nin and Henry Miller that kind of really put the NC-17 thing on the map. I think that was I can't remember the name of that movie right now. But that's something that came out of like 1990.
Was that Henry and June?
Henry and June, yeah.
Henry and June. Okay.
Yeah, and that was like one of the movies that forced or that put the NC-17 thing, you know, because there was these claims for like these decency and morale. What is it? It's not obscenity. It's obscenity laws is what. And you know, someone could charge you with obscenity. And obviously, if you're going to put something like this in the comic store, where obviously the general public is thinking comics are where like you have Archie and Superman and you know and Super Friends and next and Screamers next to that, you're like, what the fuck is this? What the fuck is this? Comic shop owner, you know, wait to sit you down for you know. Again, it goes back to your thing, Tinsent Plague, in terms of like you're trying to like poison the fucking youth with some shit like this because this is really. I mean, as bad as all the EC comic shit was, this is on a whole nother level. A whole nother level.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's totally true.
It's really wild. Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any? So, is there any final thoughts you want to put out on Skreemer and Pete Milligan and what he's doing?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I think this is although not perfect, but what story is, and yes, there's a lot of issues, as we've discussed, that you could certainly talk about that are things that could be done differently or better in some ways with Skreemer. Just overall, this is a very serious piece of work that has a tremendous amount of stuff about it that is really quite impressive, along with being transgressive and boundary breaking. Like we talked about, the art is at an incredibly high level. The storytelling from Ewins and Dillon, along with the design work, the acting of the art, and just so much of this is just done at such an incredibly high level, and it's so ambitious. And I think that's something that we're going to probably come back to again and again on Comics Rot Your Brain, especially as we discuss comics from the 80s, because you and I read a lot of comics in the 80s, Chris, and I think we didn't realize at the time what a halcyon time and what a golden age the 80s really were for comics. But I think it really speaks to when there are movements in the air artistically, how that ambition and that sort of hope and potential in the air becomes kind of like a wind that lifts up everybody. And it's sort of like this rising tide lifting all boats, but not just in the terms of like sales or anything, but just in terms of artistic possibility and artistic imagination, because this is coming in the wake of Watchmen, Dark Knight, Mouse, and all those things happening a few years earlier. And this is at a moment where the potential for comics, not just being for kids anymore, feels, I think, truly limitless to the creators who are in that orbit. And you can see Milligan, Ewins, and Dillon taking full advantage of this. And this is their big break on an American comic for DC Comics. It's their first work for the publisher. And good Lord, are they swinging for the fences. And this is just an extraordinarily ambitious piece of work. And I think you just don't find that many comics that even try to do half as much as Milligan is doing storytelling wise with Skreemer here. And I think it's something that should be remarked upon and noted, that for all the failings of the story, there are also considerable, tremendous successes. And I think that's exactly what I wanted us to be able to do on the show here is, like I say, kind of reckon with this work that exists, that's out there, that maybe not a lot of people are talking about, and just kind of hold it up in 2021 and just say, what is brilliant here? What's good, bad, and indifferent, and in between? And I think there's a lot in Skreemer that's amazing, and right down to the design and these incredible covers. And I think if you're curious at all about this batshit story you've heard us talking about, I would heartily recommend that everyone go read this, because we've only scratched the surface in some ways in terms of the bizarreness and the storytelling and the thought that's gone into so many levels of this. So I think it's a work that everyone should look at and be familiar with, because it's not a minor work. I think it's a fairly significant miniseries from DC in the 80s. I think it's a work that should be remembered and talked about, because there's a lot going on here that you don't see very often in a comic book.
No, you know what? I agree with everything you're saying. I feel like, it's one of the things that, like, even today, where you can pretty much publish what you want if you have some stature, maybe through Image, right? Like, I mean,
Yep.
I don't even feel like most of the Image books, look, there's a lot of interesting kind of like science fiction stuff coming out of Image. A lot of it is like adventure science fiction or action science fiction, and this kind of like post-apocalyptic kind of like, it's like a fugue type of storytelling that I think there's very few writers who are able to approach this level of storytelling and what he's trying to say in the comics. And it's not. This is something that I don't think, again, it wouldn't translate well into a TV show or a movie, and it wouldn't work. And this wouldn't work as a novel. I don't think. I think it's one of these few things that work solely perfectly as a comic, and that's above. Again, I'm not going to take away from anything that we were saying is problematic. I do feel that all the good things far outweigh the problematic stuff with it. It's not even really problematic. I mean, it's problematic. It's just, I think, from our lens. But then again, some of the violence is problematic, maybe from any era's lens.
Yeah.
But look, Peter Milligan, I remember his name more from like Shade, the Changing Man,
Right.
like more so than this. And I feel like, this is him kind of like, and Shade is like that's a superhero that he kind of like put into the Vertigo mold and kind of like altered up. And I kind of feel like, again, these creators who are able to like do stuff whole cloth on their own without any kind of like IP driven stuff, I think they're always able to kind of like tread
different ground that is more in tune with what really turns them on as creators and artists than I'm just trying to service like some corporate IP. Now, granted, corporate IP, like again, Shade, Swamp Thing, Sandman Mystery Theater, to name a few, like Animal Man, like aren't these kind of like, corporate shill work, but this is a different kind of thing. I mean, it's, I don't think that the Invisibles is able to be published unless this book is out. I don't know if most of stuff that comes out of Vertigo is able to come out unless this is out, because 4 years before Vertigo, you read this and everyone is like, we can do this at DC. We can, I mean, like,
Yeah. Like if Pete Milligan could do that, like, oh shit, we can do literally just about anything.
I mean, it's testament to Karen Berger, like finding these British writers who could and artists who could bring something new to the comic world, because that Marvel at this time in the late 80s was shutting down their epic line. I think the last truly long epic series that came out was Akira. And I think that was such a long running series because there was so much content. I think if that was a shorter book, they would have shut Epic down like a long time before that. I don't know if to do with the bankruptcy stuff that was going on or other kind of like weird kind of like publishing move things. I don't know how successful books like Dreadstar were. It wasn't that successful because they moved it to First after he took it away from after Epic got shut down. So I just think that the Epic wasn't the thing that Marvel was maybe trying to do, and I don't know, maybe this because Archie Goodwin had left. I'm not sure all the backstory on that, but I feel like this was
I'm not sure either.
This was laying the ground for what 90s comics could be, because I feel like so many books that we love in the 90s, like does Stray Bullets does Stray Bullets exist without this book? Do so many books that were these independent things, do they exist without something like Skreemer? Like, I mean, particularly as you tell me it was up for like this award. Like, if this book came
it won the Eagle Award.
If this book was under the radar and no one watched it, or no one read it, that's a different story. But for it to win a major award is giving everyone license to go, we can like explode what's on our brain and tackle stories and tackle subjects and themes that we maybe couldn't do and we didn't think we could do in comics.
No, 100%. 100%, and tackle them in a way that's so brutal and explicit. And yeah, the themes are the heaviest themes of like, existence, life, death, morality. I mean, this is the heaviest, weightiest stuff you can tackle in fiction. And Milligan goes there and he doesn't shirk from it. He doesn't hesitate. And Milligan, Ewins, and Dillon and Ziuko, they all go there. And actually, we haven't mentioned the letterer, Tom Frame, but it's hand lettering and the lettering looks terrific. And, love me some hand lettering and it looks great. Like the whole team did it just an immaculate job. It's an incredible piece of work. And yeah, and to everything you're saying, I think they blew the doors wide open, and I think it really did pave the way for a lot of stuff. And I will say my final comment will be that I know I've heard Grant Morrison talk about Pete Milligan, and just to your point about the Invisibles, I'm pretty sure that Grant and Pete were friends, and they knew each other well. But I've heard Grant talk about how Pete Milligan was and probably still is one of his favorite writers. And Grant Morrison really, really loved Pete Milligan's writing and thought very highly of him. And I remember hearing Grant Morrison say that he thought Enigma, the miniseries that Milligan would go on to do later for Vertigo, Grant Morrison holds that up as one of the greatest miniseries, one of the greatest comic book stories ever. I've heard him talk quite lovingly about Pete Milligan's Enigma. And, that really shows you that Milligan, I think, in a lot of ways is a lot of, I don't know, he's a lot of writers' favorite writer, but even if his stories and his work never got the mainstream sort of acceptance of like a Watchmen or a Dark Knight, I think Milligan, sort of like Jamie Delano, was one of these British writers that people in the know realized was the real deal and is the real deal, and is a writer of considerable talent and was putting out, and perhaps is still putting out, I haven't read his work recently so I can't speak to it, but I think the feeling was clear amongst those who really understood comics and his fellow writers that Pete Milligan was a major talent. And I think Skreemer really, really illustrates that beautifully, along with being a tremendous testament to the work of Brett Ewins and Steve Dillon. And I know that Milligan and Ewins did one other sci-fi gangster-ish looking book that I think I have a paperback of it, but I don't think I've ever read it. And it was called Johnny Nemo, and it was a book that was published in the UK. And so, yeah, you know, who knows? Maybe we'll check that out and do a read through of that one day. But I just wanted to mention for the record that we are aware that there is another Milligan-Ewins collaboration out there. So perhaps we'll dive into that at some point. But they're a hell of a team, and Skreemer's a hell of a book, and obviously has inspired a whole lot of discussion. So
For sure.
I encourage everyone to check it out.
Okay, so that's this week's episodes of Comics Rot Your Brain. We will be back next week with some other books you probably haven't heard of or don't remember, or or maybe you have. We will see. But anyway, I'm Chris, and I am signing off for Steve as well. All right, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.